A rescued mountain lynx had attacked every keeper who came near, until she sat calmly by its cage. The trap had been set deep in the snow, hidden under a thin layer of pine needles and frozen mud, exactly where a careful animal would step. And she had stepped there. That single fact stayed with Ranger Owen Birch for months afterward. The lynx, who had survived years in one of the most unforgiving mountain ranges in the Caucasus, had been undone by something so simple, so deliberately cruel, and so entirely human. Owen had been doing his morning patrol along the eastern ridgeline when he noticed the ravens. There were 4 of them, circling low above a cluster of spruce trees about 40 meters off the marked trail. Ravens in the mountains were not unusual, but the way they circled was different. Patient, unhurried, certain. That combination told him what was happening below them. The ravens knew the difference between a carcass and a creature still in its last struggle. They always waited for the suffering to stop before they descended. While the struggling continued, they waited. They were very good at waiting. He left the trail and pushed through the snow, his boots sinking past his ankles with each step. The cold that morning was the kind that pressed against your face and tried to push its way into your lungs, the kind that made every breath feel deliberate and earned. His breath came out in short white bursts. The trees here were close together, their branches heavy with overnight snow, and the light between them was dim and a pale, bruised blue. He heard her before he saw her, a low, broken sound coming from somewhere in the shadows between the pines. Not quite a growl and not quite a cry, something between the two, something that existed below the ordinary register of animal communication, a sound that no creature makes unless it has been in pain for a very long time and has passed through the fighting phase into something quieter and more enduring. He had heard sounds like it before in his years of patrol work, and they had never stopped being difficult to hear. She was lying on her side in a shallow depression in the snow, and the trap had closed around her left rear leg, just above the ankle joint. It was an old-style steel trap, the kind that had been illegal in this region for over a decade, the kind that cost almost nothing to buy, and caused a kind of damage that was not reversible by any available means. Her leg had been in it for what Owen later estimated was at least 2 full days. The snow around the trap was disturbed in a wide, dark circle that told a story without words. The desperate and exhausting story of how long and how hard she had fought before the exhaustion finally won. She was a mountain lynx, fully grown by the look of her. Roughly 25 kilograms of muscle and bone and dense winter coat, with the wide tufted ears and the broad flat paws that made her species so perfectly adapted to this specific terrain, these specific depths of snow, this specific quality of cold. Her coat was pale gray with dark markings that shifted when the light shifted. A coat built not for beauty, but for invisibility, in exactly this kind of forest. Her eyes, when she opened them and found him standing there, were amber. A deep, clear amber, the color of pine resin held up against firelight, transparent and full of depth at the same time. And those eyes were completely alert. Not glazed, not distant, not faded by pain into the 1,000-yard emptiness that meant the battle was nearly over. She was watching him with full awareness, which meant she was still tracking, still processing, still using the part of her mind that had kept her alive in these mountains for years, and was not going to stop now simply because the circumstances had become extreme. She watched him the way she would have watched anything that came close to her in this forest, with complete attention and no readable expression and an absolute refusal to pretend he was not there. Owen stopped moving. He crouched down slowly, lowering himself until he was below her eye level, keeping his gaze slightly to the side of her face, rather than directly into it. He had worked with wildlife long enough to know that direct eye contact with a large cat was not a gesture of openness or goodwill. It was a challenge, coded into millions of years of behavior, and this was absolutely not the moment for challenges. He spoke quietly into his radio, never taking his full attention away from her. He gave his coordinates, described what he had found, gave his best estimate of how long she had been in the trap based on the evidence around her, and asked for backup and a transport vehicle. The response came back through static. The nearest wildlife rescue center with the capacity to handle large cats was in the south, 6 hours by mountain road. There was no closer option. They would need to transport her. The 40 minutes that followed were the most careful work of Owen's career. He and his patrol partner, a younger ranger named Colin Webb, used 2 sets of thick protective gloves, a long-handled catch pole, and a transport crate kept in the patrol vehicle for exactly these situations. Nothing about it went smoothly. Despite 2 days in that trap, despite the weakness and the pain and the cold that had been working on her the whole time, she had enough left to lunge twice before they managed to position the crate. One of those lunges caught the back of Colin's left hand and opened a cut that bled darkly through his glove for the rest of the morning. Getting the trap mechanism open without causing additional damage to the leg required a specialized tool that Owen had to go back to the vehicle to retrieve, leaving Colin alone with the catch pole and the Lynx for 7 full minutes. Colin said afterward that those 7 minutes were the longest of his working life, not purely because of the danger, though the danger was real, but because of the way she watched him. Even restrained, even barely able to move, she watched him with those amber eyes, and there was something in the watching that was more unsettling than anger. Anger would have been readable. This was something quieter and more complete, the absolute, unblinking attention of an animal that was not going to stop paying attention, no matter what happened. When the trap finally released, and she was eased into the transport crate, she went quiet, not calm, quiet. There is a distinction between those two states that matters enormously to anyone who works with animals in distress. Calm is a settled thing, a loosening of tension at the source. Her quiet was a compression. She gathered herself into the smallest shape she could manage inside the crate, and she pressed her cheek against the metal floor and she breathed. Just breathed. One breath, and then another, and then another. Owen knelt beside the crate as Colin started the engine, and for a moment, he looked at her through the wire, and she looked back at him, and he felt something that he could not have named at that moment. It was not sympathy exactly. It was more like recognition. Like looking at something that had been strong and free and complete unto itself, and understanding what it cost to still be alive when none of those things were true anymore. The drive south took 6 hours and 20 minutes. Owen rode in the back of the vehicle with the crate, monitoring her breathing and talking in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular. The road conditions, the weather, the names of the peaks they were passing through. He talked not because he believed she understood the words, but because the sound of his voice was something predictable, something constant, and predictability in this situation was the only thing he had to offer her. She did not sleep. She lay still, but she did not sleep. Every time the vehicle shifted on the mountain road, her ears moved. Every time Owen paused between sentences, her eyes tracked toward him to check whether the pause meant something had changed. She tracked everything. Even now, even like this, she tracked everything. He found himself thinking, during those long 6 hours in the back of a vehicle on a mountain road in the cold, that he was witnessing something that deserved a word he did not have. Some specific word for the quality of presence that refuses to dim under pressure, that keeps all its instruments running right up to the edge of what is survivable and possibly beyond it. The Kevser Wildlife Rehabilitation Center sat at the edge of a pine forest, on the southern slope of a long valley. It was not a large facility, and it made no pretense of being one. The main building was an old converted farm structure with stone walls and a new metal roof that rang when it rained. Behind it, connected by a series of covered walkways, were the animal enclosures. A row of large cat holding pens built from heavy gauge wire and treated timber posts, each one designed to give the animal inside enough space to feel the possibility of movement without the degree of freedom that would make captivity an ongoing agony to endure. It was the kind of facility that stayed open on determination and commitment rather than comfortable budgets. The people who worked there knew this and worked there anyway, which said something specific about who they were. The center's head keeper was Dmitry Volkov. He was in his mid-50s, not tall but solid, in the way that comes from decades of physical work in cold places, rather than from any deliberate effort to be solid. His forearms carried the accumulated record of his career, in 2 long scars on the left and 1 shorter one on the right, each with its own occasion and its own lesson, none of which he discussed unless someone asked directly, and even then only briefly. He met Owen's vehicle at the gate and looked through the wire of the transport crate without speaking for a long, unhurried moment. Then he said quietly, "How long?" "Best estimate, 48 hours, Owen said. Dmitry nodded once and walked alongside the crate as it was carried into the treatment area. He did not say anything else, but his face, which was not an expressive face under ordinary circumstances, carried something that Owen recognized from mirrors. The specific look of someone confronted with a problem they intend to solve and are not yet sure they can. The veterinary examination revealed what Owen had feared. The lynx's left rear leg had sustained significant tissue damage from the trap mechanism and from the cold over those 2 days. The joint itself was intact, which was the single piece of good news in the entire assessment. But the soft tissue surrounding the joint was severely damaged and infected. Infection at that stage in a field animal was never a simple matter. She had also lost considerable body weight. She was thin in a way that large cats only get when food has been genuinely scarce, not for days, but for a longer period, which suggested that her condition before the trap had not been optimal. Perhaps the winter had been hard. Perhaps the territory had shifted somehow. The forest did not leave explanations. Dr. Helen Marsh conducted the examination with the efficiency of someone who has learned to move fast, without appearing hurried. She was precise and methodical, and completely focused on the task in front of her. She administered antibiotics, addressed the leg wound as thoroughly as the animal's condition allowed, confirmed no signs of systemic illness beyond the infection, and stepped back when she had what she needed. The prognosis on the leg was cautious. Recovery of the tissue was probable. Full mechanical restoration of the joint was less certain. Time would have to answer that part. When they moved the lynx into the largest of the rehabilitation enclosures, Dimitri stood outside the wire in the cold evening and watched her for a long time. She positioned herself in the corner, where the 2 walls met. The far corner, the one that put maximum space between herself and the wire, and maximum visibility over the entire enclosure floor. He noted this in his log. He noted everything in his log, always had. 23 years of careful daily entries in notebooks that lined an entire shelf in his office. He gave her the name Taiga that evening, after the vast cold northern forest that had no single owner and no single center and belonged entirely to itself. He wrote the name at the top of her intake file in his careful compact handwriting, and below it, the date and the location and his best estimate of her age. He did not write down the quality of her eyes. He did not write down the way she had watched him standing outside her wire, cataloging him with an intelligence that had nothing domesticated in it, nothing that made allowances for the difference between a threat and a person who was doing their best. He told himself it was not relevant data. He was wrong about that, but he would not understand why until the following winter. The first week was about survival in its simplest form. Taiga ate inconsistently. A piece of meat left near her end of the enclosure on the second day was gone by morning. Nothing on the third. Something small on the fourth. Dr. Marsh came daily to check the leg through the treatment slot in the wire, a built-in feature of all the large cat pens that allowed for minor procedures without requiring anyone to enter the enclosure directly. Taiga tolerated the daily approach the way a mountain tolerates the wind, with no perceptible response that was not already present, with no adjustment that acknowledged the approach as something separate from the ongoing reality of her situation. Dimitri ran the feeding rotation the way he always had. The long-handled tray through the lower access panel, his body positioned well away from the wire. He had done this hundreds of times, with hundreds of animals, over 2 decades. He had seen recently captured animals behave in ways that looked dangerous, and had watched them settle, as the stress of capture diminished, and the environment became familiar. He expected this to follow that pattern. On the 8th morning, he approached the enclosure at his usual pace. Steady, neither hesitant nor aggressive. The pace of a professional who has done this long enough that the confidence is real. He was carrying a feeding tray. He was wearing his usual jacket. He was doing everything exactly as he had done it every morning for 23 years. Taiga came off the floor and hit the wire with a force and a speed that made the whole panel ring out across the yard like a struck bell. Dimitri stumbled backward. The feeding tray went to one side. He caught himself, before going down, and stood in the cold morning air, breathing hard, his heart loud, looking at the lynx who had already returned to her corner and was watching him with those amber eyes, flat, patient, entirely purposeful. He stood there for a moment. Then he retrieved the tray, replaced the food that had spilled, slid it through the access panel from the farthest available distance, and walked back to the main building. He told himself it was the trauma. He told himself it was the pain and the newness and the stress of captivity. He had seen this before in captured animals. The defensive strike that is really a louder form of retreat. The aggression that comes from fear rather than predatory intent. He had seen it resolve. He expected this to resolve. He believed this, mostly. But in the quiet, honest part of his mind that he did not speak from often, he registered the speed of that movement and the precision of it, and the fact that her eyes had not shown the wild, scattered quality of an animal acting from panic. They had been steady, aimed, and the small honest part of him that would not be silenced filed that away, without comment, and waited to see what came next. What came next was more of the same. In the second week, Colin tried the morning feeding round and received the same result. Tyga hit the wire the moment he crossed the threshold, and the impact rang against the fence post, and Colin stood there, collecting himself for a long moment, before completing the feeding from maximum distance and writing up the incident in his careful handwriting. In the third week, a keeper named Gary came in for a covering shift. He had worked at 2 other facilities before this one. He read the intake file. He understood the protocols. He approached with the measured confidence of someone who had handled difficult animals before, and knew how to carry himself in that context. He crossed the threshold and Tyga was at the wire before he had finished his step, and the force of it sent him sideways into the outer fence post, and he sat down in the snow with his hands shaking. He was not hurt. The wire held. But the shaking hands were their own kind of record, and Gary submitted his request to be removed from Tyga's rotation the following morning. Professional, specific, entirely reasonable. Dimitri approved it without discussion. There was nothing to discuss. The request was correct. But the request added weight to a situation that was already becoming heavy. 3 incidents in 3 weeks. 3 different keepers. The same essential result each time. The center had 6 permanent keepers. The number who had experienced direct contact with Tyga's threshold response was building. The number who now arrived at the morning shift and spent an extra half-minute gathering themselves before approaching her section of the yard was also building. These were not failures of character. They were rational responses to what had been observed and felt, but the practical consequences were real. An animal that could not be safely approached could not receive the ongoing care that continued recovery required. The longer the situation continued unchanged, the narrower the path forward became. Dimitri called the staff meeting on a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week. He laid the situation out in his usual measured language. Physical improvement was clear and ongoing. Behavioral pattern was unchanged, and showing no sign of resolving on its own. Current management could continue in the short term but was not indefinitely sustainable. The options were 3. Continue current protocol with formal reassessment in 4 weeks. Bring in an outside specialist, or escalate to the Regional Wildlife Management Authority to determine whether the center had the capacity to manage this case long-term. The room was the kind of quiet that comes when people are thinking harder than they want to about things they are not sure they can solve. And then Alice spoke. She was 23, the youngest keeper on staff, 8 months at the center, primarily working with smaller animals. She was quiet and observant, and had the particular quality that some young people have of watching everything and saying very little until they have something specific to say. She said, "I've been watching the incident reports. She never goes low. Every incident, without exception, she aims at face height. Not the torso, not the legs, not the arm at its natural position when extended. Face height, every single time." The room shifted. A frightened animal does not aim. A frightened animal strikes at whatever is closest and easiest and most accessible in the moment of the strike. The consistency of face height targeting across every incident said something that was not about fear as a general state. It said something about memory, about something specific that had happened, at face height, in the life of this animal before she arrived at this center. Dimitri wrote it down. He underlined it. He did not yet know what to do with it, but something in the way Alice had said it told him it was the first genuinely new piece of information they had assembled about Tyga since her arrival. Not another record of what she did. A glimpse, however small and provisional, of why. He submitted the required incident report to the regional authority that evening. Then he sat at his desk with Tyga's file open in front of him, thick with notes now, and felt the honest frustration of someone who has done his best work and found it insufficient for this specific problem. 60 kilometers north of the center, in a top-floor apartment near the university, a young woman named Marta Allen sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by research papers and field notebooks, and 2 empty cups of coffee. She was 26 years old. She was in the final stages of writing her 3rd-year ethology thesis, and the kitchen table was covered in the materials of someone who has been working on one problem from too many directions for too long. Her supervisor had told her the work was rigorous, and the central insight was genuine. What she needed now was to finish saying it clearly. The thing she was trying to say clearly was this. The existing literature on aggression in captive animals assumed that overt aggression was evidence of reduced fear. The more committed the aggression, the less afraid the animal was presumed to be. Attack and terror were treated as inversely related. But her own 2 years of careful, quiet observation at a local rescue shelter, working with cats that had come in from abandonment and mistreatment and difficult histories, had shown her something more complicated. The most committed, the most precise aggression she had witnessed was often not the least afraid. It was the most afraid. It was fear that had been refined by experience into a system. Fear that had learned the most effective form it could take, and had taken it, consistently and reliably, with the cold efficiency of something that had no room for error. She was writing this with care and with appropriate humility, because she knew her sample was small, and her conclusions needed to be clearly marked as provisional. She was writing it also with conviction, because she had seen something real and was determined to find the language that made others see it. She had applied to the Kevser Center for a 3-month volunteer placement 6 weeks earlier. She had not yet heard back. She was beginning to think the application had been lost in whatever administrative process received these things. The acceptance email arrived 11 days later, on a Tuesday morning, while she was reviewing her bibliography. Dmitri had read her application twice. The sentence that had stayed with him was from her cover letter. She had written that she was most interested in animals that other people had given up on understanding, because she believed that what looked like disorder was usually a coherent response to something that had not yet been identified. He did not know if she would be useful in practical terms. He did not know if she had the steadiness for what Taiga could produce at close range, but he had run out of the approaches he knew, and sometimes that was exactly the right moment to let in someone who did not yet know where the limits were. He sent the acceptance. Then he went out into the yard and stood outside Taiga's enclosure in the cold and looked at her. She was in her corner, watching him. "Someone is coming," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I don't know if it will help, but we're going to find out." Taiga watched him for a moment longer. Then she turned her head slightly toward the far end of the enclosure, and then back to him, and then she lowered her chin to the floor. He wrote in his log that evening, "Behavioral status unchanged. Volunteer placement starting next week." And then, below that, in smaller writing than he usually used, "First person in a month who seemed to be asking the right questions." Marta arrived on a Wednesday morning, earlier than expected. She had taken the first bus of the day, the one that left the city before 6 in the morning, because she wanted to arrive before the main feeding rounds finished. She wanted to see the animals in the first alert period of the morning, the window of time before the facility's daily routines had settled them into their adjusted responses to the predictable patterns of the place. Animals in first alert showed more of what they actually were. After routines set in, they showed more of what they had adapted to be. She was interested in both, but she was most interested in the first. She brought 2 notebooks. The observation notebook was fresh and empty. The questions notebook was already half full from the preparation she had done in the 2 weeks since the acceptance email arrived. She had read every incident report that was publicly available through the Regional Wildlife Authority database. She had read the center's published intake records going back 4 years. She had ordered 2 specific papers on large cat trauma response, and read them both twice, making notes in the margins. Dmitri met her at the gate. He was the kind of man who looked exactly as his work had made him. The scars on his forearms, the solid build, the measured way he moved through the yard, as if every step had been considered before it was taken. He shook her hand with a directness that she found immediately comfortable. He was not a man who performed warmth. What warmth he gave was real, understated, and sufficient. He walked her through the facility, with the economy of someone who has shown many people around many times, and has learned that the place speaks better for itself than he can speak for it. She asked questions in what he recognized, though he could not have immediately said why, as the right order. Feeding schedules before enclosure design, individual behavioral profiles before general protocols. She had done serious preparation, not the surface-level reading that most placement students arrived with, but the kind that went back through primary records and found the threads that connected them. When they reached Taiga's enclosure, Marta stopped. She stood 3 meters from the outer wire and looked at the Lynx without speaking. Taiga found her the moment she came into the visual frame of the enclosure. The amber eyes moved to her and stayed there with the full, unblinking attention that Taiga gave to everything she needed to understand. Marta looked back. She looked for a long time, in a way that Dmitri found himself watching with a sideways attention, because the quality of it was unusual. It was not the focused attention of assessment, though it was certainly that too. It was something more open, more receptive, the attention of someone who wanted to understand something before they categorized it, who was willing to spend the time that understanding required. "She's not in her corner because she's hiding," Marta said. "What do you mean?" Dmitri asked. "The angle," Marta said, still looking at the enclosure. "She can see the entire floor from there. She can see both gates and the full approach from the yard. She chose that position because it gives her the most information about everything that moves in her environment, not because it's the most sheltered spot." A pause. "There is no genuinely sheltered spot in a wire enclosure, and she knows that. So she found the position of maximum information instead." She was quiet for a moment. "She's not a casualty," she said, almost to herself. "She's a soldier." Dmitri was quiet. Marta took out her observation notebook and wrote something. The sound of her pen on paper was sharp and clear in the cold morning air. Inside the enclosure, Taiga's ears moved. Both of them, precisely, tracking the new sound, logging it, folding it into the catalog she maintained of everything that moved and sounded in the world she now inhabited. Marta noticed the ear movement without looking up from the page. They went inside. Dmitri made tea. Marta opened her questions notebook, and for 2 hours, she asked him about every incident in the log, every detail, the angle of approach, the distance at which each threshold response occurred, the time of day, what the keeper had been carrying, what direction they had been coming from, what Taiga's body position had been in the moments immediately before each strike, whether she had vocalized, what sound, if any, had preceded the incident. She wrote everything. She drew a rough diagram in the margin, mapping each incident against the geography of the enclosure. When they were done, she turned the diagram toward him. "Every incident occurred when someone crossed into approximately this band of space," she said, indicating a zone about 2 meters from the outer wire. "Not at the wire itself, 2 meters back. That's the consistent threshold across every incident." "I noticed the distance factor early on," Dmitri said. "It's not distance," she said. The distinction mattered, and she was clear about it. "It's sight lines. That band is the zone of clear, unobstructed approach. The zone in which she has enough visual distance to accurately calculate the trajectory and timing of what is moving toward her. She's not responding to how close someone is. She's responding to being within the range where she can act effectively." Marta looked at the diagram. "Those are different things, and they suggest different responses." He looked at the diagram for a moment. "And if someone stayed outside that range," he said slowly, and made no move toward it, "they would not register as a threat in the category she has been responding to," Marta said. "Not immediately. The question is whether consistent presence without action, repeated over enough time, can give her system a new category, something it currently has no room for at all." "What category?" "Something that comes near and does nothing. Something that does not fit the pattern of what she knows to be true about things that enter her awareness zone." She looked at her notes. "Right now, every interaction she has with humans confirms the model. Someone approaches, she responds, they back away. We have been teaching her, over and over, that her understanding of the world is correct. We need to give her inputs that her model cannot account for." She closed the notebook. "Can I start tomorrow morning?" He thought about the protocol. He thought about the regional authority requirements, and the formal reassessment he had committed to, and all the structures he had built around the situation. He thought about the sentence in Marta's cover letter that he had read 4 times. He thought about Alice's observation about face height, still sitting in his mind without a clear meaning attached to it. 7 o'clock, he said, before the feeding rounds. Marta nodded. She had already opened the questions notebook again and was writing. Outside in the cold enclosure, Taiga had not moved from her corner. She had watched the 2 of them at the wire, and through the building window the entire time they were in the common room. She was still watching now. She tracked what she could see, and held the rest in the part of herself that held everything, and she waited with the patient, total stillness of an animal, that has learned that waiting is not passive, that waiting is its own form of readiness. She did not know what was coming, but she was paying attention. She was always paying attention. The first morning, Marta brought a wooden stool, her observation notebook, and a thermos of strong tea. She set the stool down 4.5 meters from the outer wall of Taiga's enclosure. This was not a random distance. She had calculated it from the incident reports. The threshold zone began at approximately 2 meters from the wire, and 4.5 meters from the outer wall placed her outside that zone by a margin that was meaningful, but not so large as to be entirely outside Taiga's primary observation range. She sat down. She opened her notebook to a blank page. She poured a small measure of tea into the thermos cap. She set the cap on the ground beside the leg of the stool. She looked at the blank page. She did not look at the enclosure. Dmitri watched from the window of the main building. Alice stood beside him with her own cup of tea. Neither of them spoke. In the enclosure, Taiga was at the back wall. She had shifted from her default corner to a position that gave her a cleaner viewing angle on this new element in her world. She lowered herself to the ground with her chin just above the cold floor and looked at the woman on the stool. The woman did not look up. Taiga's ears moved forward, both of them, precisely, tracking the sound of the pen on paper, a small dry sound she had not heard before, and was now logging. The sound of the thermos cap being set on the ground, the soft, even pattern of breathing in the cold air. Everything was being registered and sorted and filed against the existing catalog of sounds she had assembled since her arrival. The pen sound was new. She noted it and folded it into the picture she was continuously maintaining of everything that moved and sounded in her environment. At 12 minutes, she stood and moved toward the near wall of the enclosure. Slowly, with the slight compensation in her gait that the healing leg still required. She stopped about 3 meters from the wire's inner face and sat down and wrapped her tail around her front feet and looked at Marta with a concentration that had shifted slightly in quality from her usual surveillance mode. This was different from surveillance. This was looking at something that did not immediately fit the existing categories and giving it the time and attention that things requiring new categories demanded. Marta wrote in the margin of her notebook, without looking up from the page. Moved to near wall at 12 minutes. Deliberate positioning. Ears forward, not pinned, tail wrapped and controlled. No vocalization. Uncertainty, not aggression preparation. The session lasted 45 minutes. Marta filled 4 pages of observation notes, carefully marking in the margins that her observations were made from peripheral vision only, and therefore partial. When the time was up, she stood, capped her pen, picked up her stool and her thermos, and walked away from the enclosure without looking at it. She went inside and wrote without stopping for 20 more minutes. When she finally looked up, Dmitri and Alice were watching her from the other side of the table. "She's not hypervigilant," Marta said. "She's hyper-accurate. Those are different things, and they require completely different responses." She explained the distinction carefully. A hypervigilant threat detection system was one that had lost its calibration. It fired at stimuli that were not genuine threats. It could not reliably distinguish between different levels of danger. It was running over threshold, beyond what the actual situation warranted. You could approach that kind of system with arousal reduction, with graduated exposure, with desensitization protocols. Those were the correct tools for a system that had become dysregulated. But a hyper-accurate system was something entirely different. A hyper-accurate system was precisely calibrated and running correctly. It was not broken. It was functioning exactly as it had been built and refined by experience to function. The problem was not with the tool. The problem was with the information the tool had been given. The model of the world it was working from was accurate within the limits of the data it had received, but the data was incomplete. You cannot habituate a hyper-accurate system the way you can a dysregulated one, Marta said. You cannot reduce the arousal level and have her relax, because her arousal level is exactly proportionate to the threat profile she has built from her actual experience. To change the response, you have to change the data. You have to give her inputs that her current model cannot account for. And sitting on the stool does that, Alice said. It is what I am attempting, Marta said. I'm a data point she currently has no category for, something that enters her awareness zone, does nothing, and leaves. If I keep being that data point consistently and without variation, her system will eventually have to account for me. It will have to build a new category. And how long will that take? Dmitri asked. She was honest. I don't know. It depends on how rigid the existing model is, and what originally built it. The face height targeting that Alice identified concerns me. A specific anchor like that can indicate either a very rigid model, because it is tied to a clear and specific memory, or a potentially flexible one, because specific patterns can sometimes be specifically contradicted with the right kind of counter-evidence. She paused. I don't know which this is yet. I'll know more after a week. The second morning, Taiga came to the near wall at 8 minutes, not 12. The new sound and the new presence had been logged, and the assessment period had shortened. The third morning was a rain morning, cold and heavy, the kind of rain that turned the yard to mud and ran in dark lines off the edges of the pen roofs. Marta sat on her stool in the rain with her notebook held under the edge of her jacket to keep it dry. Taiga came to the near wall at 9 minutes, despite the rain. The rain was irrelevant to her assessment. The routine was what she was tracking. On the fourth morning, Taiga was at the near wall at 4 minutes. She was sitting 2 feet from the inner face of the wire. Between her and Marta, who was on her stool, 4.5 meters away, with her head down and her pen moving, there was 2 feet of wire and an open yard and the cold morning air. Taiga's nose moved, a small, precise intake of breath, noting whatever the morning carried from the direction of the stool. On the fifth morning, 2 minutes. On the sixth morning, the full 45-minute session spent at the near wall, 7 minutes longer than any previous session because Marta had arrived slightly early, and the time extended without any decision being made about it. On the seventh morning, when Marta came through the gate, Taiga was already at the wire. She had come to the near wall before the gate had opened. She was sitting 2 feet from the inner face of the wire, looking at the gate, not with the braced tension of an animal waiting for something it needs to be ready for. Simply waiting, the way something waits when it has decided that an arrival is coming and has organized itself around that certainty. Marta set down her stool and sat down and opened her notebook and wrote 1 line. Then she stopped writing. She sat with her pen against the page and the cold morning air around her, and let the full weight of what was happening settle into her carefully. It was not the kind of thing you wanted to rush past. In the margin of her notebook, after a long pause, she wrote in very small letters, Day 7. She came to the wire before I sat down. She underlined it. Then she added below the underline, in even smaller letters still, she is not performing anything. She just is. She sat for the full session. When she finally stood and picked up her things and walked toward the building without looking back, she knew without looking that Taiga was still at the wire, that she had not moved back toward the corner or toward the center of the enclosure, that she was watching the gate. Dmitri had watched the session from the window. He had watched all 7 sessions, though he had not mentioned this to Marta. He did not feel the need to explain it. He was the head keeper, and watching was part of his job, and watching this was something he needed to do for reasons he had not fully worked out yet. When Marta came inside that morning, he was still at the window. He did not immediately turn. She was there before the gate opened, he said. Yes, Marta said. He turned. What does that mean to you? She thought about the honest answer. It means she's building something between sessions. She's not starting from zero each morning. She's carrying something forward from the previous day and bringing it with her to the wire. What she's carrying is information, data that her system is accumulating and has not yet fully classified, but is treating as significant enough to respond to in a specific way. And when it classifies it, then we see what category she puts me in, Marta said. And we go from there. He called Nora Fleming that evening. He told her everything. When he finished, Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, How does the girl sit? He thought about the question, which was unusual. Completely still, he said. She doesn't adjust her position. She doesn't fidget. She just sits. Then she's teaching the cat something more than she knows she's teaching, Nora said. Most people, even the ones who are trying to be calm near a frightened animal, are not genuinely calm. The body gives it away. The tension in the shoulders, the slight irregularity in the breathing, the micro-movements of someone who is monitoring and hoping for an outcome. An animal reads all of that. It reads the intention behind the body, not just the body. A pause on the line. Your volunteer isn't monitoring. She's genuinely present. That cat can tell the difference, because the difference is real. After the call, Dmitri sat in his office with the lamp on and wrote in his private notebook, the one that was not for the regional authority or the official incident logs, but for the thinking he did at the outer edge of what he understood. She is not teaching Taiga anything. She is being something Taiga has not encountered before. That is the teaching. The weeks that followed built on each other in the quiet, accumulative way of things that are working without announcing themselves. Marta continued the morning sessions. Taiga continued to come to the wire before the gate had finished opening. The sessions lengthened slightly, because leaving, when the moment for leaving arrived, took a small internal effort that had not been present in the first week. The sessions continued, because leaving had become the thing that required the decision, not staying. Around the third week, Marta noticed something she had not set out to observe and had not expected to find. She noticed that she was genuinely calm, not managing her state, not maintaining composure in a challenging situation. Genuinely, structurally calm, in the way of someone who has found the specific thing they are built to do, and is doing it without friction. She had spent 2 years wondering whether her interest in traumatized animals was a practical vocation, or simply a disposition of her character. Sitting on this stool in this mountain valley, she understood that the distinction was false. The quality that made her want to understand something before categorizing it. The quality that allowed her to be present near suffering without immediately wanting to fix it or move away from it, was both the interest and the skill at once. They were the same thing expressed at different scales. She wrote in her questions notebook that evening, which was unusual. I do not know if this can be taught. It may be something a person either has or does not have. If it cannot be taught, the question of replication is more serious than the paper I am planning can address. Another person with the correct theoretical framework but the wrong quality of presence would not get this result. They might confirm the model instead of contradicting it. She held this concern. She did not have an answer to it yet. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept the questions that were too large for the current stage of the work, and that would require more time, and more cases, and more evidence before they could be properly addressed. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Dmitri, meanwhile, had begun to look at his 23 years of work through a slightly different angle, not a critical angle. He was not a man who was quick to doubt what had served him well. But he had been watching Marta on those mornings, from the window, and he had been thinking about the difference between what she was doing and what he knew how to do. What he knew how to do was excellent. It had helped a great many animals, but it was built on action, on technique, on the deliberate application of accumulated knowledge to a problem in order to produce a specific result. He was very good at that. What Marta was doing was not that. What Marta was doing was not the application of a technique. It was the maintenance of a quality. And the quality was not patience exactly, though patience was part of it. It was something more active than patience. It was presence that gave nothing and took nothing. Presence that made no claim and held no expectation. Presence that was simply, completely, reliably itself. He had not known that was a skill. He had not known it was something that could be offered to an animal that was suffering. He had not known, because nothing in 23 years of this work had required him to know it, and nothing he had learned had taught it to him. He was learning it now, at 54, by watching a 26-year-old sit on a stool in the cold and turn the pages of a notebook. He was not sure what to do with that knowledge. He filed it beside Marta's concern about replication, in the part of the mind where things go that are true and important, and not yet fully understood. The veterinary examination that could not be postponed arrived on a Thursday morning 5 weeks into Marta's placement. Dr. Marsh had been conducting external monitoring for long enough. The surface healing was complete. The infection markers had been clear for 3 weeks. Taiga's weight was stable and improving steadily. Her coat was maintaining well, and her behavioral indicators were all consistent with a cat whose physical health was genuinely progressing. But the joint itself required a proper direct assessment, not through the treatment slot in the wire. An examination close enough to accurately evaluate the joint mechanics, close enough to determine with real precision whether the structural recovery was what the external signs suggested. The standard response to this situation with an animal of Taiga's behavioral profile would have been sedation. Full sedation for a large cat carried its own risks, and for an animal carrying residual physiological stress, those risks were not theoretical. If there was any alternative, Dr. Marsh wanted to find it. She went to find Marta. Marta listened to the full description of what the examination required. She was quiet afterward, not because she was uncertain about whether to attempt it, but because she was thinking carefully about the cost, if the attempt went wrong. The architecture of what 5 weeks had built between her and Taiga was specific and particular, and had been constructed from one consistent, repeating element. She arrived, she sat, she did nothing. Every session was defined by the absence of purpose or intention toward Taiga. The moment she or anyone accompanying her introduced intention toward the animal, she would be introducing new data into a model, that had only recently and very cautiously begun to update. New data requires processing time, she said, and what you're describing would introduce a significant amount of new data in a short period. I understand, Dr. Marsh said. If she shows any preparation to move, we stop completely and walk away. The doctor was direct and certain. I have been reading animal bodies for 20 years. I will stop when she tells me to stop. Marta thought about it for a moment longer. Let me sit with her for 20 minutes first, standard session. Then you come in, and we observe what she does. We do not push past what she shows us. Dr. Marsh agreed. So Marta went out with her stool and her notebook, and she sat beside the enclosure in the usual way, and Taiga came to the wire in the usual way. Immediately, before Marta had fully settled onto the stool, the 20 minutes passed in the usual quiet, and the cold morning was around them both, and everything was as it had been for 5 weeks. The pen, the thermos cap, the even breathing, the 2 feet of wire between them, the amber eyes that were simply there. Then the gate opened, and Dr. Marsh came through it. She moved at a pace slower than her usual professional walk. She was wearing a jacket that Marta had asked her to change from her normal one, because familiar scents in a new context were still familiar, but a small novelty in the scent picture might introduce a fraction of assessment time before pattern recognition activated. She stopped just inside the gate. She stood completely still. Taiga's ears moved. Both of them. Her eyes went to Dr. Marsh, and a low sound came from her. Not the sharp warning vocalization of the early weeks. Not the complete silence of her baseline surveillance mode. Something between the two. A sound that carried information without committing to action. That was itself a question asked in the only language available to her. Dr. Marsh did not move. Marta was writing. Pen on paper. The steady, familiar sound. Taiga looked at the doctor. Then at Marta. Then back at the doctor. She was running the new input against the existing categories, looking for the folder it belonged in. Something had arrived that did not match the expected morning. There were 2 humans instead of 1. One of them was Marta, who was doing what Marta always did. The other was different. Different required assessment. The doctor took one slow step forward. Taiga's weight shifted onto her front feet. The muscles along her shoulders changed, in a way that was visible from where Marta sat. Her body organized itself against possible necessity. Not into action, but into readiness for action, which was a different and more controlled state. The doctor stopped. 40 seconds of complete stillness. The yard was quiet. The mountain above the tree line was clear against the cold blue sky. A bird somewhere in the pines made one sound and stopped making it. Then Taiga's weight shifted back, not to full relaxation, but back from the edge of commitment, back into the watchful middle ground. The doctor took another step, stopped, waited. The process took 11 minutes. 11 minutes to cross the yard and reach the outer wall of the enclosure. 11 minutes of single steps and stops and readings and adjustments and the continuous, wordless negotiation between what the doctor's training and experience told her was appropriate and what Taiga's body, moment by moment, indicated was permissible. 11 minutes of Marta's pen on paper, providing the one familiar, unchanging reference point, in a situation that was otherwise entirely without precedent in Taiga's experience of this place. When Dr. Marsh finally reached the wire, she stood completely still and looked. She did not reach through the wire. She did not produce any instruments. She looked with the trained, experienced eyes of someone who has learned, over 20 years, to gather more information through careful observation than most people gather through physical contact. She noted the joint. She noted the structural elements that she needed to evaluate. She watched the subtle weight shifts and adjusted postures that told her things about range of motion and load distribution that no external measurement could have conveyed as accurately. She spent 4 careful minutes at the wire. Then she stepped back, one slow step at a time, exactly the way she had come in. When she reached the gate and closed it behind her, she walked back to the main building, without hurrying and without looking back. Taiga did not retreat to her corner. She turned her head, not toward the gate through which the doctor had left, toward Marta. Marta was still on her stool, still writing. She felt the shift in Taiga's attention without looking up. She felt it in the way you feel another set of eyes come to rest on you. A slight change in the quality of the air between you. Something that registers before you consciously register it. She finished the word she was writing. She set the pen down on her knee. She let the moment settle into her properly. She wrote, Tolerated close veterinary presence throughout full procedure duration. No strike. No retreat. Body tension present and visible but entirely controlled throughout. Below that, in her small letters, when it was over, she looked at me. Not at the doctor. At me. She held her pen above the page for a long moment. Then she wrote, she was checking whether I was still here. That sentence did not leave her for the rest of the day. She carried it through the debrief with Dimitri, and through the afternoon session with the questions notebook, and through the long drive back to her apartment that evening. The animal had just endured something entirely unprecedented in the context they had been carefully building together. A second human, physically close, with visible intention. And when it was over, the first thing she had done was locate the one constant in her environment and verify that it was still present. This was not trust in the full sense of the word. Trust in its complete form is a large thing, built slowly and verified repeatedly over a long time. But it was something trust could grow from. Something more specific and more honest than early trust, the beginning of knowledge, the beginning of a world in which one element of the environment could be counted on to be what it had always been. And that knowledge, however small and specific and fragile, was enormous in its implications for an animal that had been given so many reasons to believe that reliability did not exist. Dimitri said it simply when they debriefed. She trusted the process. She trusted that I would stay, Marta said. The process was a consequence of that, not the cause. He looked at her for a moment. Is that what you've been giving her? The staying? I've been showing up, she said. She built what she built from that. I didn't build it, I just kept arriving. She closed her notebook and held it in her lap and looked out the window toward the enclosure, where Tyga was still near the front of the space, still watching the yard, but in a posture that was subtly different from what it had been in the early weeks. Less compressed, less charged. The difference between a fist held tight and the same hand simply held still. Dimitri looked too. He was thinking about something he had believed for 23 years, which was that care required action, that expertise expressed itself in doing, that the work was the application of accumulated knowledge to a problem in a way that produced resolution. He had built his entire professional identity on that belief, and it was a good belief, and it had been earned through real work, and it helped a great many animals. He was sitting with the quiet, uncomfortable truth that sometimes the most important thing a person could do for an animal that had suffered was simply to be near it, without agenda, without technique, without wanting anything from it at all, until the animal could build the knowledge, on its own terms and from its own evidence, that nearness was not automatically danger. He had not known how to do that. He had not known it was a thing that needed to be known. She trusted that I would stay, Marta had said. He thought about that for a very long time. What Marta wrote was not a long paper. That was the first thing the people who received it noticed. It was clear and carefully scoped and modestly argued, and on its surface, it did not look like a document that would travel far or change anything in particular. It looked like what it was, a thoughtful, rigorous case study by a student who had been honest about the limits of her sample and had not tried to claim more than she could support, which was exactly what it was, and which was also, in the particular way of things that point accurately at something real, considerably more. She titled it, Behavioral Adaptation in a Traumatized Large Felid in a Rehabilitation Context. The section structure was conventional: intake conditions, incident record, observational methodology, session record, veterinary procedure outcomes, analysis, conclusions and implications. The intake section drew entirely from Dimitri's log and from Dr. Marsh's veterinary notes, both fully credited at the outset and throughout. Marta was explicit about this, in a way that went beyond convention. She wrote that the precision of the documentation she had inherited was itself a form of care, that the value of careful records was not always visible in the moment they were made, but became visible when someone arrived who needed exactly the information that had been preserved. 23 years of Dimitri's careful daily entries had given her work a foundation she could not have built herself. She meant this genuinely. It was not a courtesy. It was true. The incident section described the 5 weeks of threshold responses in measured, specific language: distances, angles, timing, positions. Alice's observation about face height targeting was named early and credited prominently. Marta wrote that this observation had been the first moment in the documented history of Tyga's care at the center, when someone had looked at the behavior not as a problem to be managed, but as a communication to be decoded. She wrote that this shift, from management to interpretation, had been the turning point from which everything else followed. This was accurate. The third section was where the paper became something more than its stated scope. She wrote about the distinction between hypervigilance and hyperaccuracy. She defined both terms rigorously, citing the existing literature, and marking precisely where the distinction she was drawing departed from the prevailing convention, and on what basis. She wrote about the practical implications of the distinction for rehabilitation methodology. She explained why conventional desensitization and arousal reduction approaches had failed in this case, and argued that the failure was not a failure of technique or commitment, but a failure of categorization. The right tools had been applied to the wrong problem. The problem had been misidentified, and the misidentification was understandable given the available framework, but it had been costly. She wrote about the sessions on the stool. 1 paragraph per day for the days that mattered. What happened at what minute, what Tyga's body communicated, and what Marta believed it said, always with clear acknowledgement that she was one observer, with one case, and could not make universal claims from this evidence alone. The paragraph about day 7 was the one that traveled farthest. It was referenced by other practitioners in other countries, quoted in internal reports, brought up in conference discussions. It described the morning in exactly the terms she had used in her notebook in that cold yard, the animal at the wire, before the observer arrived, the posture differing from previous sessions in specific measurable ways, the observation that the animal was not performing anything, that she was simply present. She let that stand without elaboration. It did not need elaboration. Professor Gould read the paper twice and asked whether the results were replicable. She said she did not know. She said the result was specific to this animal, in this context, with this particular convergence of factors, and that the specific intervention depended entirely on qualities of the person involved that could not be accurately described as technique or method. They were qualities of character, and she was not certain whether qualities of character could be taught, though she thought they could sometimes be cultivated in people who had the underlying basis for them. She said the paper's contribution was not a replicable protocol. It was a better description of the problem, and a better description of a problem was often more useful than a protocol for solving a different problem. He gave her the highest available mark. She was more interested in what happened after. Dmitri sent a copy to Nora Fleming in Tbilisi with 1 line of text. Nora read it the same evening, and forwarded it the next morning to a colleague in Warsaw, who worked on captive large cat welfare protocols for a regional conservation network. The colleague in Warsaw sent it to a researcher in Bucharest. The researcher in Bucharest was presenting at a regional rehabilitation conference 3 months out, and asked whether the author would present. Marta said yes, and prepared the presentation the way she prepared everything. At the conference, she was the youngest presenter by a significant margin, and the one the room was most attentive to. Not because of dramatic claims, which she made none of, because of the quality that practitioners in that room recognized. Someone who had looked at something very carefully and reported exactly what they had seen, without the desire to make it more than what it was. Dr. Peter Gallagher from Minsk asked during discussion whether the result was replicable. She gave the same answer she had given Gould. He pressed, if the intervention depended on specific personal qualities, what was the paper actually contributing? She had thought about this. A more accurate description of what you are looking at, she said. If practitioners keep misidentifying hyper-accurate threat response as hypervigilance, they keep applying the wrong tools. And when the wrong tools fail, they confirm the animal's model. They teach it that its understanding of the world is correct. Every failed intervention is another data point supporting the original fear. She paused. The paper isn't telling people what to do. It's telling them what they're looking at. What they do with that depends on who they are and what they are capable of. He accepted this answer. He said it was admirably honest. The paper was distributed through the Regional Rehabilitation Network newsletter to 422 practitioners across 9 countries. The strongest responses came from the people working in the smallest facilities, the ones running on commitment and thin budgets, the ones who had sat in staff meetings where someone said, if we can't safely manage her, and had felt in their whole body what that sentence was building toward. Those practitioners wrote to Marta, not all of them with agreement, some with sharp technical questions about methodology and sample limitations. some with accounts of animals in their own care that seemed to match the pattern she had described. Some with questions that were really about something else, about whether the work was worth doing, whether it mattered, whether the small and difficult and expensive work of bringing one specific animal back from the edge of what could be survived was something the world owed to the animal, or only something the people involved owed to themselves. She answered every message over 4 weeks of evenings, specifically and directly, without claiming more than the work supported. She read each message carefully before answering it, and answered what was actually being asked, which was not always what had been written. She stayed in the field. She kept working. She kept sitting with the animals that other people found difficult to understand, and she kept bringing to those animals the particular quality of presence that was simply how she moved through the world, and which she had learned, in a cold mountain valley on a wooden stool, had a name and a function and a value that she had never previously understood. The question that had been in the background of everything finally came to the front and had to be answered. Could Taiga go back? Dr. Marsh conducted the formal assessment in the spring. The physical examination was thorough and carried out in the new way, with Marta present, with approach in careful stages, with full and genuine attention paid to what Taiga's body communicated at each point, and complete readiness to stop if the communication said stop. The findings on most measures were good. The infection was completely gone. The tissue had healed cleanly. The weight was solid. The coat was full and maintaining properly. By most of the markers that mattered, Taiga was a well animal. The gait evaluation took longer, and was conducted multiple times across multiple days. Dr. Marsh watched Taiga move under different conditions, at the walking pace she used when crossing the enclosure without urgency, at the faster pace she used when moving toward the feeding tray, at the adjusted weight distribution of a body working against different loads on the platform and off it. She watched with the trained patience of someone who has learned that the most important information is not always in the largest movements. Sometimes, it is in the small compensations, the micro-adjustments, that a body makes automatically when one element of its mechanical structure is not fully reliable. She found those compensations. Small, not visible to most observers, not invisible to her. She wrote in the assessment report with the care that a decision of this weight required. The compensatory mechanics observable under higher load conditions are not consistent with the demands of sustained mountain hunting activity. A lynx in the wild pursues prey repeatedly and at speed across uneven, high-impact terrain through the duration of an entire winter, with margins for error that are thin by nature and that do not accommodate structural unreliability. The observed compensatory patterns indicate that the joint, under field conditions and over an extended period, would not be mechanically reliable. Release into the wild is not recommended. Long-term rehabilitation placement is the appropriate designation. She showed the report to Dmitri before submitting it. He read it. He read it a second time. Then he set it on his desk and sat with it for a moment. She makes it work in the enclosure, he said. She adapts. She does, Dr. Marsh said. But the mountain is not the enclosure. He knew this. He had been knowing it, in the quiet, honest part of him, for several weeks. The report was making official what he had already understood. He wrote the notation in Taiga's file. Permanent rehabilitation placement. His small, careful handwriting. The file was thick now with over a year of careful documentation, layer upon layer of observation and analysis and care, all of it adding up to a life that was not the life she had been built for and was going to be lived here nonetheless. He thought about what Alice had told him months ago, about how Taiga had stopped pressing the corners, how she had started using the center of the enclosure for resting in the afternoon hours, how she had started using the platform, how the behavioral picture, read carefully and as a whole, looked less like an animal enduring a temporary situation and more like one that had made its own decisions about a permanent one. She had decided before they had. She had come to her own understanding of where she was and what that meant, long before the assessment confirmed that where she was where she would remain. She had not needed their permission to accept her situation. She had looked at what she had and made of it what she could, and what she had made was a life, reduced in some ways from what the mountains would have given her, specific and particular in ways the mountains could not have been, and genuinely hers. He called the staff meeting to tell the team. Alice asked what changes. He said, "Nothing that matters. The protocol stays, the relationship stays, the work stays." What changes is that we stop measuring her against what she was, or what she might have been. She is what she is, here, now. That is what we care for. The enclosure had been modified in the months since Marta's first morning on the stool. A covered section for shelter in heavy weather. A raised platform at the back where the afternoon light came in warmly in the low sun hours. Natural substrate replacing the compacted gravel in the main area. A wider variety of enrichment placed at intervals along the inner perimeter. These were not dramatic changes. They were the specific changes of a facility that has decided that an animal matters for its own sake, that the quality of a life in this place is worth attending to for as long as the life continues. Taiga used the platform every afternoon when the light was right. She lay stretched along its length with her chin on her paws and her eyes on the tree line beyond the far fence, and she used it with the unself-conscious ease of something that has decided this is its place and does not need to announce that decision. She used the center of the enclosure for her morning rest. She used the near wall of the enclosure in the mornings when Marta was there. From the platform, on clear days, she could see the direction of the mountains. Dmitri retired in the spring of the following year. He submitted his notice in January, arranged the handover with Alice, and spent his last 2 months working exactly as he always had, because there was no other way to do the work. On his last day, he stood outside Taiga's enclosure for a long time. She was on the platform. She watched him from up there with her amber eyes, steady and full, in the way she watched everything she needed to understand. He stood still outside the wire in the patient, giving nothing, taking nothing way. That was the only language she fully trusted. He had learned that language late. He had learned it by watching someone else who had always spoken it. But he had learned it, and that was not nothing. He nodded once. He did not speak. Then he turned and walked to the main building. Alice took over the center from a Monday morning in late April, and ran it the way it needed to be run, which was the only way she knew how to do it. She had learned to be near Taiga in her own way, not Marta's way, which was specific to Marta and could not be transferred whole to anyone else, but a version that was genuinely hers, a way of moving through the enclosure during maintenance that Taiga had come to find unremarkable, a way of standing near the wire in the afternoons that Taiga had come to find familiar. She tolerated it, and then, over time, went further than tolerance, went to a small, specific acknowledgement, expressed in the particular quality of stillness that is an animal not preparing to act, that this presence was known, and was not a cost. Marta visited twice a year. The visits were their own thing, not the sessions, which had been the careful, incremental building of something from nothing. The visits were the inhabiting of something already built and established and continuing. In late autumn of the 3rd year after her placement, she sat beside the enclosure in the cold morning, and Taiga came to the wire, as she always did, and they sat together without agenda, and the light came across the enclosure, in long pale lines, and the mountains above the tree line were white and clear. Marta was not writing observations. She was just sitting. She had been doing this work long enough now to know something she had not known when she first set the stool down in this yard. She knew that there were times when the documentation and the analysis and the theoretical framework were the substance of the work, and there were times when the sitting itself was the substance of the work, and those two modes were not different in value. They were different expressions of the same thing. The paper she had written mattered because it was true and pointed at something real, and the morning she was spending on this stool mattered because it was itself real, and both kinds of mattering were genuine, and neither was a substitute for the other. When she finally stood and gathered her things, Taiga moved along the wire, following her toward the gate, as she did every single time, every visit, every morning session, every leaving. Marta walked through the gate and pulled it closed and stood on the other side in the cold. She said, for the first time, "I'll be back." She knew the words themselves meant nothing to Taiga. She said them anyway, because they were not for Taiga. They were for herself. The acknowledgement, spoken out loud for the first time, of what this had given her. The specific knowledge of what her own capacity was and what it was for. The understanding, earned and now permanent, of what it looked like when fear became a system, and what it required to give that system something new to work with. The experience of sitting in one place, without purpose, for long enough that something built from years of suffering decided, on the basis of evidence, to add one new category to its understanding of the world. She walked back toward the main building. Behind her, she did not hear Taiga move away from the wire. Inside, Alice was at the table writing feeding records. She looked up. How was she? Alice asked. She was herself, Marta said. Alice nodded. She always is. That was the right answer. That was, in fact, the whole of it. Tyga was always herself. The trap had not made her something different. The months of fear and the loss of the mountains, and the strange constrained life of the enclosure, had not replaced what she already was. They had been added to it, and she had continued, not unchanged, never unchanged, but continuous. The thread from before to after was intact, and what held it intact was the same thing that had always been there, the specific, particular, entirely her own quality of presence, that watched everything, and missed nothing, and made its decisions on the basis of what the evidence actually said. On the platform in the afternoon light, she lay with her chin on her paws and watched the direction of the mountains, and her breathing was slow and even, and her coat moved slightly in the wind that came down the valley from the high peaks, and she was there. Fully, completely, without reservation, there. The ravens that had circled over her in the snow on the morning Owen found her were long gone. They had moved on, as ravens always do, but she had moved on too. Not in the same direction, not back to what she had been. Forward, into what she had become. An animal on a platform at the edge of a pine forest, settled into the specific, irreplaceable, imperfect, genuine life that remained to her. Not the life she had been built for, a life nonetheless. Made from what was available, by an intelligence that had survived everything that had tried to diminish it, and had come through the other side still itself. She had always been good at making do with what was available. The mountains had taught her that, in the long years before the trap. The trap had tested it to its limit. One young woman on a stool in the cold had given her, one careful morning at a time, something new to work with. She had taken what was given, and built from it what she could. She was still here. She was always going to stay. The snow had not let up since before dawn, and by the time Owen reached the patrol vehicle, the laces on his boots were frozen solid, and his hands inside the thick gloves had gone partly numb from the work of releasing the trap mechanism. He sat in the passenger seat while Colin drove and held his hands against the heating vent and watched the mountains through the fogged window, and thought about the crate in the back, and the animal in the crate, and the quality of attention those amber eyes had maintained throughout the entire operation. In 22 years of wildlife patrol work, he had encountered large cats on 12 occasions, leopards twice, both times in the Eastern Territory near the Georgian border, a young male cheetah confiscated from an illegal sale in the city, 8 mountain lynx at various stages of injury or distress, including a very young female found abandoned near a burned section of forest the summer before last. In each encounter, the thing he had noticed most was not the size or the capability for harm, though both of those things demanded attention. It was the quality of awareness. The way that a large cat, even in distress, never entirely stopped performing the continuous, comprehensive assessment of its environment that was the foundation of everything it did. It did not panic the way smaller animals panicked. It did not go into the frantic, undirected response of something that had lost its relationship to the present moment. It stayed in the present moment. It stayed more completely in the present moment than most humans were capable of achieving under ordinary circumstances, let alone under extreme ones. This one had been in a trap for 2 days. She had been in pain for 2 days. She had been without food and water for 2 days, in temperatures that would have compromised a less robust animal, significantly more than they appeared to have compromised her. And she had watched them. She had watched every movement and tracked every sound, and filed every piece of information, and she had been still, and she had been present, and she had been, underneath all of it, entirely and unshakably herself. Owen thought about this on the long drive south, and he could not articulate to himself exactly what it was about it that moved him. But it did. Something about the refusal of that quality of presence to be diminished by what had happened to her. Something about the cost of maintaining it, and the fact that she maintained it anyway, not because she had decided to maintain it, but because it was what she was, and she did not know how to be anything else. He checked on the crate twice during the drive. Both times she was still. Both times those eyes were open and those ears were tracking everything. He called the center 3 hours into the drive to update Dimitri on their estimated arrival time, and to relay the most recent information about her condition. Dimitri asked specific questions in a specific order, that revealed a specific and careful mind. He asked about the position of the leg in the crate, about whether she had vocalized at any point during the journey, about whether she had accepted water when offered through the wire. She had not accepted water. She had not vocalized. The leg was resting at a natural angle. Dmitri noted all of this, and thanked him, and hung up, and went back to whatever he had been doing, which was probably preparing the treatment area, and going over the intake protocols for a large cat presenting under these specific circumstances, because he was the kind of person who prepared for things before they arrived, rather than improvising when they did. It was late afternoon when they finally pulled through the gate of the Kevsur Center. The light was already going from the valley, the shadows of the pine forest stretching long across the snow on the slope below the facility. The air had the particular quality of a winter evening in a mountain valley, sharp and still, and full of the smell of pine resin and cold. Owen had been awake for 16 hours by this point, and his back ached from the position he had held in the vehicle's rear compartment, and he was looking forward to a strong cup of tea and driving home. But when they opened the back of the vehicle, and he looked at the crate one more time before handing it over, those amber eyes were still watching, still completely and precisely there, and he stood there for a moment longer than was necessary, just looking back. Dmitri was efficient and capable and kind in the specific, non-sentimental way of people who do hard work well. He asked Owen the questions he needed answers to, and he thanked him and his team, and he took the crate into the treatment area, and Owen did not see what happened after that, because his job was done, and he drove home, and he thought about those amber eyes for longer than he would have predicted. He thought about them again sometimes, in the weeks and months that followed. He thought about them especially on difficult days, on the days when the mountains were cold and dark and the work felt heavy, and he was not sure whether anything he did made sufficient difference to the things that were happening to the wildlife in his care. On those days, he thought about that quality of presence. He thought about how it had not dimmed or scattered or retreated into something defensive in the 2 hours he had spent near her. He thought about what it would take to sustain that kind of presence through that kind of experience, and he found that he could not imagine it clearly, but that not being able to imagine it clearly made him respect it more, not less. He checked in with the center twice in the following month. Dmitri told him the leg was healing and the animal was stable, and there were behavioral challenges that they were working to address. He did not elaborate on the behavioral challenges, and Owen did not press him. He said he was glad she had survived the transport and the first days, and that he hoped the rest of it went the way it needed to go. He meant it. In the second week of Taiga's stay at the center, Colin developed the habit of pausing at the far end of the yard before beginning his section of the morning rounds. The pause was small enough that nobody would have noticed it unless they were watching for it specifically, and nobody was watching for it specifically, because everyone had enough to attend to in the morning rounds without monitoring each other's small pauses. But it was there. A half-step of hesitation at the corner of the building before the full yard came into view. A brief gathering. He was not aware that he was doing it until the third week, when Alice passed him at that corner one morning, and said quietly, not unkindly, "You pause there every morning." He looked at her. "Do I?" "Since the second week," she said. She did not make more of it than that. She continued on, to her own section of the rounds. He thought about it on the drive home that evening. The pause was not fear exactly, or rather, it was a kind of fear, but not the simple physical fear of immediate harm. It was something more layered, the fear of encountering that quality of committed, aimed attention directed at him from the other side of the wire. The fear of the specific experience of being clearly and deliberately seen by something that had decided, on the basis of very good reasons, that seeing you first and clearly was what kept it alive. What unsettled him was not what Taiga might do. It was what Taiga's response said about him, about the category he had been placed in. He was a keeper. He had come to this work because he believed that animals deserved care and that he was capable of providing it. He had imagined himself, entering this work, as part of the solution to the things that happen to animals in an indifferent world. And Taiga looked at him and placed him, accurately, in the category of things that came close, and from which nothing good had yet come. That was a fair assessment of the evidence available to her. He understood that. He understood it intellectually, and he held it honestly, and he did not try to tell himself that the assessment was wrong. But understanding why the assessment was correct did not make it easier to walk up to the wire, knowing that those amber eyes were tracking his approach from the moment he turned the corner of the building, and would continue tracking it until the threshold was reached and the message was delivered. He talked to Alice about it one afternoon, when the rounds were done and the center had settled into the quiet of midday. He asked her whether she found it difficult in a similar way. She thought about it before answering, which was one of the things he had learned to appreciate about Alice. She did not fill in the thinking pause with reassurance or deflection. She just thought, and then she said what she actually thought. "I find it clarifying," she said. "She's showing me exactly what the situation is. She's not pretending. She's not performing. She's telling me the complete truth about what my approach looks like from her side of the wire." A pause. "Most of the time when I'm dealing with an animal in distress, I'm inferring. I'm reading signals and making educated guesses and adjusting as I go." She removes the guessing. "She's very clear." "That clarity," Colin said. "Does it bother you?" "It reminds me that this is her situation, not mine," Alice said. "My discomfort is a minor thing in the context of what she's living through. Remembering that helps." He thought about this for a long time afterward. It helped. Not completely, not immediately, but it shifted something in how he understood the pause at the corner of the building. The pause was not just about him and what he was afraid of. The pause was also, if he chose to make it so, a moment of remembering that the situation he was walking into was primarily hers, not his, and that his job was not to resolve his own discomfort, but to minimize the impact of his presence on her. The pause did not go away, but what happened in it changed. He was glad, several weeks later, when Marta arrived, and he understood, after the first morning's debrief, what she was attempting. He was glad, not because he thought it would necessarily work, though he hoped it would. He was glad because it was the first response to Tyga's situation that did not begin with the assumption that her response needed to be managed, or modified, or corrected. It began instead with the assumption that her response was accurate, that her model of the world was built from real experience, and that what she needed was not someone to override it, but someone to give her better data to work with. He thought about the pause at the corner of the building. He thought about what it would mean to stand at that corner every morning and simply be there. Not approach, not do anything, just be there. He thought about whether he could do it, and he was honest with himself about the answer, which was that he probably could not do it the way Marta did it, with that complete and genuine stillness. But he thought he might be able to learn something from watching her try. He started watching from the window on Marta's second morning on the stool. He watched every morning after that when he could. He told himself he was learning something, and he was, though what he was learning was harder to articulate than he expected. It was not a technique. It was not something he could translate directly into a different behavior on his own part. It was more like watching a quality he did not have modeled clearly enough that he began to understand, for the first time, what it actually looked like. Not what he had imagined it looked like, what it actually was. He thought about the pause at the corner of the building, and what it might become if he let it be something other than hesitation. Dmitri kept a second notebook. This was not something he had told anyone, and it was not something the second notebook was secretive about. If anyone had found it on his desk and opened it, they would have found nothing alarming and nothing personal in the conventional sense. What they would have found was thinking. Thinking that was too tentative, or too speculative, or too difficult to categorize to go into the official log, which demanded a certain precision of language and a certain confidence of claim. The second notebook was for the other kind of thinking, the kind that circled a thing from multiple directions without arriving at a conclusion, the kind that asked questions without answering them, the kind that noticed something and sat with the noticing without yet deciding what the noticing meant. He had been keeping it for 11 years, since the male wolf that had come in from the eastern region, in a state that none of his existing frameworks had adequately described, and that had taught him, over 2 difficult months, that his existing frameworks had limits he had not previously encountered. After that wolf, after the 2 months of uncertainty, and the eventual resolution that had come from a direction he had not anticipated, he had started keeping the second notebook as a record of the thinking that happened outside the frameworks. The thinking that did not fit neatly into the official log, but that was sometimes the most important thinking he did. He had written more in it since Tyga's arrival than in any comparable period before. He had written about the quality of her eyes on the first evening. He had written about the 8th morning, and the way her strike had been aimed rather than panicked. He had written about Alice's observation at the staff meeting, and the specific weight the words face height had carried in the room, and what he thought that weight might mean. He had written about Marta's arrival, and the first morning's debrief, and the distinction she had drawn between hypervigilance and hyperaccuracy, which he had turned over in his mind for several days afterward, because it had the quality of a distinction that rearranged other things once it was understood properly. He wrote in it the evening after the veterinary examination, when he had been sitting with Marta's phrase for several hours. She trusted that I would stay. He wrote it down at the top of the page, and then he wrote below it for a long time, not toward any conclusion, but through the thinking itself, trying to understand what the phrase was pointing at, that his 23 years had not prepared him to understand. What he arrived at, or the closest he could get to arriving at it, was something like this. He had always understood care as something that was done, administered, applied. He had understood his role as the application of accumulated expertise to problems in front of him, and the expertise was real, and the problems were real, and the application was often effective, and he had helped a great many animals because of it. But what Marta was doing was not application. It was not technique or expertise or accumulated knowledge being deployed. It was a quality of presence that gave nothing, and took nothing, and asked nothing, and simply was, reliably and consistently, itself. And that quality of presence was what Taiga had been able to use to build something new. He wrote, the thing that was offered was not help, it was company. Reliable, demanding nothing, asking nothing, claiming nothing, company. And from that, she built her own help, in her own way, on her own terms. He wrote, I have been doing this work for 23 years, and I did not know company was a form of care. I thought care was always active. I did not know it could be this still. He sat with that for a long time in the lamplight. Then he wrote, I am not sure I have the capacity for that kind of stillness. I am not sure it is something that can be learned, or whether it is something you either have or do not. But I think I am going to try to find out. He closed the notebook. He went home on the mountain road. The stars above the valley were very clear and very cold, and the mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky. And somewhere inside the fence of the center, Taiga was in her enclosure, in her place, at the near wall, or on her way toward whatever position she chose for the night, and she was herself, entirely and unshakably herself, and she was staying. Alice had grown up in a town on the eastern slope of the same mountain range that Taiga had been found in, a town small enough that everyone knew everyone, and large enough that you could find quiet if you looked for it, which Alice had always been inclined to do. She had grown up with animals in the way that children grow up with animals in rural mountain towns, which meant dogs and working horses and the occasional sheep, and a consistent, unremarked presence of wild animals at the edges of the settled world. Foxes in the winter dawn, crossing the field below the house in their quick, deliberate way. Red kites circling the valley in the afternoon thermals. Once, memorably, a young brown bear who spent 3 days around the orchard at the back of the neighbor's property, before moving on with the unhurried purposefulness that seemed to characterize everything the wild world did when it came close to the human one. She had come to the rehabilitation center because of the kites, in a roundabout way. She had found one injured in a field east of town when she was 17, a young bird with a broken wing, and she had carried it in her jacket to the nearest vet she could reach, 12 kilometers away, and had sat in the waiting room for 2 hours, while they assessed it, and had felt, during those 2 hours, something settle in her that she had not known was unsettled. Not excitement, not the adrenaline of rescue, something quieter. The feeling of being in the right place, doing the right thing. The feeling that this, bringing something hurt toward help, was a thing she understood in some deep and practical way that was not just about feeling. The vet had told her the bird would likely recover with proper care, and had referred her to the Regional Wildlife Rehabilitation Network, through which she had eventually found the Kevsur Center. She had been 18 when she first volunteered there, 20 when she started her keeper training, 22 when Dmitri offered her the staff position. She was 23 when Taiga arrived, and the experience of Taiga had reorganized several things she thought she understood about the work and about herself. The face height observation had come from watching. She did not have Marta's theoretical framework, did not have the academic understanding of stress response systems and threat calibration that gave Marta's observations their specific interpretive power. But she had watched a great many animals over 5 years of this work, and she had developed the habit of noticing the things that did not match the pattern, rather than the things that did. Matched patterns told you what you already knew. Unmatched ones told you something new. Face height was unmatched. It did not fit the pattern of a frightened animal striking at whatever was closest. Closest would have been the torso, the arms at their natural position, the legs if someone was near enough. Consistent face height was not what fear looked like. It was what memory looked like. and memory was a different problem entirely. She had not known, when she said it at the staff meeting, that the observation would matter in the way it turned out to matter. She had not known it would be the thing that Marta cited in her paper as the turning point in the interpretation of Taiga's behavior. She had simply said it because it was true, and it was sitting in her, and it seemed like the right moment to say it. When Marta's paper was finished and circulated, and Alice had a chance to read it properly, the sentence that stayed with her longest was the one about the shift from management to interpretation. From managing what an animal does to interpreting what an animal says. She had understood the distinction immediately, and she had understood immediately why it mattered, and she had also understood that the distinction had a history at this specific center, in this specific case, that included the moment in the staff meeting when someone said something true that they had noticed by watching carefully. She felt a quiet satisfaction at that, not pride exactly, satisfaction, the satisfaction of having contributed something real to a process that produced something good. After Marta's placement ended, and the paper was circulating, and Dmitri had updated the protocol, and the center's approach to Taiga's ongoing care had shifted into what Alice had privately come to think of as the after period. She took on more of the direct responsibility for Taiga's daily care, not replacing Marta's relationship, which was irreplaceable, and which Marta maintained through her twice-yearly visits, in the specific and unhurried way that she maintained everything. But taking on the daily reality of care in the way that someone has to. She developed her own language for it. Not the same as Marta's, not as still, not as emptied of purpose, more active and more task-oriented, because Alice was by nature more active and more task-oriented, and there was no point in pretending otherwise or performing a stillness that was not genuine. But she brought to the daily care what she genuinely had, which was consistent attention and the specific patience that comes from caring about something for its own sake and not for any outcome you hope to produce from it. Taiga did not trust her the way she had trusted Marta. Nothing Taiga did with any other human matched what she had built with Marta, and Alice had made her peace with that early and held it easily. What Taiga did with Alice was allow her, permit her presence in specific contexts at specific distances for specific purposes. It was not a small thing. In the context of what Taiga had been when she arrived, in the context of the 5 weeks of incidents that had preceded Marta's arrival, it was not a small thing at all. Alice noted this in her own log, which she had started keeping in her second month as head keeper, and which was modeled, consciously, on Dimitri's. She wrote, "Permitted approach to within approximately 1 meter during substrate replacement task. No preparation to act. Ears tracking but not pinned. Acknowledged my presence and returned to platform." This was progress. Not dramatic progress. Not the kind that made a good story. The kind that accumulated, one permitted approach at a time, into a sustained and genuine change in how a specific animal related to a specific category of human presence. She thought sometimes about the face height observation, and about what had happened in the room after she said it. The particular quality of the silence that followed, the way Dimitri's pen had moved across his notebook without his taking his eyes from the middle distance for a moment. She thought about what it meant to notice something true at the right moment, and how much of the work was exactly that, watching carefully and saying clearly what you saw. She was trying to keep doing that. She was trying to be, in the ongoing life of this place and this specific animal, someone who watched carefully and said clearly what she saw. It was not the whole of what the work required, but it was a large part of it, and she was getting better at it every day. There was a week in February, 3 months after Taiga's arrival, when the weather turned so bad that the mountain road to the center was closed for 4 days, and 2 of the keepers could not get in. The remaining staff managed the rounds between them, which meant longer days and more tasks per person, and the particular exhaustion that comes from doing the work of several people with the energy of one. The center's heating system struggled to maintain adequate temperature in the enclosures during the coldest nights. A supplemental heater had to be rigged in the treatment area from supplies that were not designed for that purpose, and that required monitoring to make sure they did not create other problems. The foxes in the smaller enclosures were restless and vocal. The older wolf pressed himself into the far corner of his shelter and did not eat for 2 days, which was not alarming for his species under these conditions but required watching. One of the birds in the flight cage sustained a minor injury from colliding with the wire in the darkness. It was, in short, a week that did not have room in it for any additional complexity. Taiga added no complexity. She managed the extreme cold the way she managed everything, with the complete competence of something built for exactly this. She spent more time in the sheltered section of her enclosure, and less time on the platform, which was the practical and rational response to conditions in which the platform offered no warmth and the shelter did. She ate every meal that was provided. She drank. She maintained her coat through careful grooming in the hours when the temperature lifted slightly in the midday. She was not distressed in a way that required any response from the staff beyond the routine care they were providing under difficult circumstances. Dmitri noted this in his log with the characteristic understatement of his documentation style. Week of adverse weather, animal stable, behavioral modifications appropriate to conditions, no incidents. In his second notebook, which was where the other kind of thinking went, he wrote something different. He wrote, she was in a mountain range for years, in conditions like this, or worse. This cold is not a problem for her. The only problems she has in this place are the ones we have created by putting her in it. We have put her in it because she needed help, and the help required enclosure. But we should be careful not to treat our solution to her problem as something she owes us gratitude for. She is making the best of a situation she did not choose. We should make the best of our situation, which is that we have chosen it, and she has not. He thought this was important to remember. He thought it was important enough to write in the second notebook rather than the first, which meant it was the kind of important that was not administrative, and not easily communicated in the language of official records. It was the kind of important that lived in the attitude a person brought to the work, in whether you understood yourself as a benefactor or as a participant, in whether you thought you were doing something for an animal or doing something with one. He did not know, when he wrote it that cold February, that the distinction would become more clear to him over the following months. He did not know that watching Marta sit on a stool in the cold morning air and offer nothing but her presence would be the thing that made him fully understand what he had written. But he had written it, and it was there, and when the understanding arrived it had somewhere to land. The 4 days of road closure ended. The keepers came back. The center returned to its normal patterns. Taiga came back to the platform in the afternoon of the first clear day, and lay in the weak February sunlight for a long time, with her chin on her paws, and her amber eyes on the tree line. Everything continued, the way that things continue, one day at a time. Nora Fleming had been working in wildlife behavioral rehabilitation for 27 years, 3 years longer than Dmitri, and she had a reputation in the regional community of practitioners for the particular quality of her case assessments, which were known to be thorough, honest, and occasionally uncomfortable. She was not someone who told people what they wanted to hear, and she was not someone who framed difficult assessments in softening language. She framed them in accurate language, and if accurate language was sometimes difficult, that was the nature of accuracy, and not something she felt the need to apologize for. She had known Dmitri for 18 of those years, since a conference in Tbilisi where they had both presented work on behavioral rehabilitation protocols for confiscated big cats, and had disagreed productively over coffee afterward about the appropriate use of aversive conditioning in cases presenting specific behavioral challenges. They had stayed in contact because people with similar commitments in a small field tend to stay in contact, and because they had found over the years that their disagreements were productive and their agreements were reliable, and both kinds of conversation were useful. When Dmitri called her to describe Taiga's situation, she had listened to the whole account before asking anything. This was her usual approach to accounts that she was being asked to help interpret. The full account first, the questions after, because questions asked too early shaped the answers in ways that sometimes obscured rather than clarified. When he finished, she asked about the face height targeting, which she thought was the most diagnostically significant detail he had offered. She asked about the consistency of it across different keepers in different positions. She asked whether there had been any incidents in which the targeting pattern had differed. There had not. That is not random trauma response, she said. That is specific learned behavior. Something happened at face height, something that happened enough times, or with enough force, to create a persistent associative pattern. Before the trap? Dmitri asked. Almost certainly, she said. The trap would have added to the general fear load, but the specificity of face height suggests something that preceded it, something recurrent or particularly salient. What does that mean for management? It means her fear has an anchor, Nora said. It is not free-floating. It is attached to something specific, which can mean it is harder to address because it is entrenched, or easier to address because it can be specifically contradicted. I have seen both. A pause. What I would want to know is whether the anchor can be located and specifically contradicted, or whether it is too embedded to be accessible through behavioral means. The student who is coming, Dmitri said. She believes it can be contradicted through consistent presence without action. She may be right, Nora said. It depends on the quality of the presence. That phrase had stayed with Dmitri in the days after the call. Not the presence itself, which could be arranged by anyone willing to sit in a yard in the cold, the quality of it, the specific internal state that the presence expressed, the genuine, as opposed to the performed, the still, as opposed to the merely motionless. He had not been sure, before Marta arrived, whether the distinction was one he could assess from the outside. He was sure after the second morning on the stool. It was completely visible. There was nothing mysterious or ineffable about it once you knew to look for it. Marta on the stool was not performing stillness. She was not maintaining composure. She was simply present in the way that people are present when they are genuinely, completely engaged with what is in front of them, and are not simultaneously engaged with what they expect or fear or hope for. She was not expecting or fearing or hoping. She was there. Nora called him back 3 weeks into Marta's placement to check in. He told her about the session progress. She asked the same question she had asked before. How does the girl sit? The same way, he said. Every morning, exactly the same. Then keep not interfering, Nora said. I'm not interfering, he said. I know, she said. I mean, keep not interfering with the impulse to add something, to make it more structured, to introduce a second element. Whatever occurs to you as a reasonable next step, wait. Let the next step announce itself. He said he would, and he did. It was the most useful advice he received throughout the entire process. Not because he had been planning to interfere exactly, but because the advice named and gave permission to resist a pressure he had been feeling, without fully acknowledging, the pressure of his training, and his experience, and his 23 years of having been the person in the room who knew what the next step was. Letting the next step announce itself from somewhere outside his expertise was not comfortable. It was necessary. And Nora's advice had given him a framework for sitting with the discomfort instead of acting to resolve it. He was grateful for that. He was grateful in general for the network of people like Nora who did this difficult work in difficult conditions and who stayed in contact with each other, because the contact itself was a form of support, and because the work was better when it was not done alone. He had never been someone who spoke easily about gratitude, but he felt it, and he tried to act on it, which he thought was more honest than speaking about it, and less honest than the ideal, but closer to it than nothing. He sent Nora the paper when it was done. He sent it with 1 sentence of text, because 1 sentence was what he had that was adequate to the situation. She called him after reading it, to say it was exactly what she had hoped for, and somewhat more than she had expected, which from Nora was a significant statement, and he received it as such. The summer that followed Marta's placement was the center's busiest in 4 years. 3 new large cat intakes in 6 weeks, all from different circumstances, all requiring the full scope of what the staff could provide. A young male lynx from a confiscation case in the north, badly malnourished and showing the behavioral effects of months in inappropriate conditions. A female leopard cat, brought in by a local farmer who had found her caught in an irrigation channel, dehydrated and hypothermic. A subadult brown bear whose injuries from a vehicle collision on the mountain road were survivable, but required extended veterinary care and a level of daily management that strained the staff's time significantly. Taiga continued through all of it. She was not, in this period, the center's most urgent concern, which was itself a kind of evidence. Animals that have found a sustainable relationship with their captive environment do not generate urgency. They generate the quiet, consistent work of daily maintenance. Feeding, monitoring, enclosure management, the veterinary check-ins that continued at regular intervals even when the news was good. Alice managed Taiga's care through the busy summer and into the autumn, with a steadiness that Dmitri noticed and noted and did not interrupt. She was learning the work in the specific and irreplaceable way that people learn it, which is by doing it every day and letting the doing teach what the doing teaches. She was developing her own relationship with Taiga, different from Marta's in kind and similar in quality, patient, specific, and without any expectation of return beyond the minimal. The minimal, in Taiga's case, continued to grow in small and particular ways. By late summer, she no longer tracked Alice's approach with the same heightened alertness she had maintained in the spring. She tracked it, because she tracked everything, but the tracking had a different quality to it. The quality of recognizing something familiar, rather than assessing something potentially threatening. Alice noted this in her log, with the same care she brought to everything. Reduced alert tracking of familiar keeper during approach, consistent with habituation to non-threatening presence. Habituation was Dimitri's word. Alice was not sure it was quite the right word. Habituation implied that the response had been reduced by repetition. But what she observed with Taiga did not feel like reduction. It felt like addition. Like Taiga had added a new category to her inventory of known things, and was operating from that expanded inventory with the same precision she brought to everything, not less alert, not calmer in the sense of less capable, just working from more information. She mentioned this distinction to Dimitri one evening toward the end of summer, when they were both still in the main building after the other staff had left, as sometimes happened when the work had been full enough to push beyond the official end of the day. He looked at her for a moment. "That is Marta's framework," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about it since the paper, about whether it applies to what I observe with her now. And does it?" "I think so," she said. "I think what I'm seeing is not habituation. I think it's the system running on more data. The data I've provided by being consistent and non-threatening for long enough that she has enough of it to make a reliable category out of it." He was quiet for a moment. "Then the framework generalizes," he said. "It might," she said. "Within limits. Within the specific limits of what I am, which is not Marta." "No," he agreed. "But you are what you are, and what you are is sufficient for what you've built with her." She sat with that. She thought it was probably true, though she was less certain than he sounded. She thought that certainty about these things was itself a kind of error, a premature closing of the question before the evidence was complete. She thought that the question of whether what she had built with Taiga was sustainable and sufficient would only be answered by its continued building, which was still happening, every day, one morning at a time. She told him this, and he nodded, and they sat in the late evening of the main building of their small facility, at the edge of a pine forest, and said nothing more for a while, which was its own kind of conversation between people who had worked alongside each other for long enough that the silence was comfortable. Outside, in the enclosure, Taiga was on her platform. The last of the summer light was going from the sky above the valley, and the mountain was dark above the tree line, and the air was beginning to carry the first faint chill of the coming autumn. She lay with her chin on her paws, and she watched the sky go dark, and then the stars appeared above the mountain ridge, and she watched those too, and she was there, and she was present, and she was completely and unshakably herself. When Marta stood in front of the room at the rehabilitation conference in Bucharest and began her presentation, she was wearing the same gray wool sweater she wore for most of her serious work. She had not thought to dress differently for the occasion, and would not have thought to even if she had considered it, because the question of what to wear to a presentation was less interesting to her than the question of what the presentation should actually say, and whether it said it well. The room held about 60 practitioners. They were the particular kind of professional that wildlife rehabilitation conferences attract, which is to say, people who have chosen a field that is underfunded and physically demanding and emotionally complex, and who have chosen it because they believe the work matters enough to choose it. They were not easily impressed. They were not in the habit of politeness for its own sake. If they asked questions afterward, it was because they had real questions, and if they were quiet during a presentation, it was because they were actually thinking about what was being said, rather than waiting for an appropriate moment to appear attentive. They were quiet during Marta's presentation, not the polite quiet of people performing engagement, the working quiet of people thinking. She started with the intake conditions. She described the trap, the transport, the first assessment, in the same measured language she had used in the paper. She described the 8 days before the first incident, and the incident itself, and the pattern that followed. She put the incident report data on the slide behind her. 23 incidents, all within the 2-meter threshold zone, all targeting face height, all happening within 1 second of threshold crossing, and let the data speak before she spoke about it. She said, "This is not a record of aggression. This is a record of communication. An animal communicating, with the only means available to it, a very specific and coherent position. That position is, I have evidence for what happens when you come close, and I am telling you what will happen when you come close." She said, The question is not how to stop the communication. The question is how to give the communicator new information so the communication can change. She talked for 35 minutes. She showed the data from the sessions on the stool, the daily notes mapped against the minutes at which Taiga moved to the near wall of the enclosure, the curve from 12 minutes on day 1 to immediate on day 7. She showed the data from the veterinary examination session and the body language readings she had taken throughout. She did not show photographs because she did not take photographs, because her presence in that yard had never been about documentation in that sense. She did not have something to show. She had something to describe. She described it clearly, and without drama, and the room stayed quiet, and she was done. The questions were good questions. Dr. Gallagher's question about replicability was the one she had anticipated, and she gave the answer she had prepared, which was the honest one. A veterinarian from Budapest asked about the joint assessment outcomes and the long-term prognosis for the leg, which she answered from the data Dr. Marsh had shared. A young woman from a center in Slovakia asked about the specific quality of stillness she had described and how it was developed, and Marta said honestly that she did not know whether it was developed or whether it was simply present in some people and not others, and that the question of whether it could be cultivated in people who did not naturally have it was one she was actively thinking about, but did not have an answer to yet. The young woman from Slovakia said, "I think I might have it. I just did not know it was useful." Marta said, "Then use it, and come back and tell me what you find." She meant this completely. The paper was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a question that was larger than one case, and would require more cases and more evidence, and more honest, careful observation, before it could be properly answered. She needed people who were trying the thing in their own contexts with their own animals, and reporting back with what they actually found, including what did not work, and where the limits were. She was not interested in confirmation. She was interested in the complete picture, which included the places where the framework failed as much as the places where it held. 3 people came up to her after the session. 2 of them had animals in their current caseloads that they thought might fit the pattern she had described. One of them had an animal that she had been managing for 2 years with conventional approaches, and with whom the conventional approaches had produced no meaningful change. She was frustrated with the lack of progress, and was beginning to consider whether there were other options. Marta gave her the paper, which the woman had already read, and she gave her contact information, and she said, "Try the stool. Try exactly what I described, 1 morning at a time, without expectation and without variation. And write down what you find, even when what you find is nothing." The woman said she would. Her name was Clara Webb, which Marta found briefly interesting, because Owen's patrol partner had been named Colin Webb, and she wondered for a moment whether the world was really as small as it sometimes seemed, or whether Webb was simply a common name. She went back to the center once more, before the year was out, on a gray November morning, when the first snow of the season had come and gone, and the yard was frozen, and Taiga was on her platform, in the weak morning light, looking at the direction of the mountains, with her usual patient attention. Marta set up her stool in the usual place. Taiga was already at the wire. They sat together in the cold for 50 minutes. Marta did not write anything in her notebook. She had brought it out of habit, and she held it in her lap, but she did not open it. There was nothing to record that the sitting itself was not already recording, in the only medium that mattered. When she stood to leave, she stood slowly, and she stood in a way that was different from how she had stood on all the other mornings. She stood in the way of someone who is not hurrying away from something but simply completing something that has reached its natural resting point for now. She picked up the stool and the thermos and the closed notebook, and she stood for a moment before turning toward the gate. Taiga did not move from the wire. Marta turned toward the gate and walked through it and pulled it closed and stood on the other side of it in the cold morning, and the whole of the past year was present in the morning, in the specific way that certain mornings are present. She could feel all of it. The first morning, the silence, the pen on paper, the rain morning, day 7, the examination with Dr. Marsh, the debrief, the question of going back and the answer that the leg gave, the platform, the afternoons, all of it present in this one morning at the end of November, in this specific cold yard at the edge of a pine forest in a mountain valley. She said, "I'll be back." She walked back toward the main building. She did not look back. She knew what was behind her. She had always known what was behind her. She had learned it one morning at a time, sitting still in a cold yard with a notebook in her lap and no agenda and nothing to offer except the one thing that had turned out to be exactly what was needed. Herself. Simply, unreservedly, without performance or pretense, herself. The center continued its work through the winter, and into the next spring, and on through the years that followed. Animals came and went. Permanent placements were added and, when their time came, mourned. The staff changed as staff changes in places that do the kind of work that requires long commitment from the people who stay, and honest departure from the ones who find other callings. Alice ran the center with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, and made the adjustments that needed making, and held the things that needed holding, and did not make more of herself in the process than the work required. Taiga continued. She was a healthy animal and a long-lived species, and there was no particular reason to expect that her time at the center would be short. She used the platform. She used the shelter. She used the center of the enclosure for her afternoon rest. She allowed Alice's presence and tolerated the approaches of newer staff with a patient, calibrated assessment that was not warm and was not cold, but was simply accurate, which was what it had always been and would always be. Marta visited, not as often as either of them might have chosen in a different world, because the world arranged itself around the work, and the work was in many places, and the visits were twice a year, and were what they were. They were enough. They were what was available, and Taiga had always made what was available into what was needed, and she did this too. In the spring of what would turn out to be Taiga's 4th year at the center, a journalist writing a piece for a natural science publication visited the facility to talk to Alice about the center's work, and happened to ask about Taiga, whose story had become modestly known in the specific circles of wildlife rehabilitation practice, if not beyond them. Alice told the story simply and factually, the way she told most things. She told it from Taiga's arrival to the current state of affairs, including the period of incidents and Marta's placement, and the development of the framework and the paper, and the eventual designation of permanent placement. She told it the way a keeper tells a story, which is to say with the animal at the center, and the humans as the circumstances the animal was required to navigate. The journalist wrote it up with skill and care, and the piece was published with a photograph of the center, taken from the valley road, the enclosures just visible through the pines. Taiga herself was not photographed. Alice had decided, and Dmitri had agreed before his retirement when Alice consulted him about the visit, that photographing Taiga for a publication was not something the center wanted to do. It was Taiga's story, but the story did not belong to whatever audience might encounter a photograph. The story was between the people who had been part of it and the animal at its center, and some things should remain between the parties to them. The piece was read by people who were interested in wildlife rehabilitation, and by people who were not particularly interested in wildlife rehabilitation, but who found in the story something that spoke to questions they recognized from their own experience. The questions about fear and what it does to a creature, about what it means to offer something without expectation, about the long, patient work of building trust with something that has every reason to refuse it, about what it looks like when something that has been hurt decides, on the basis of evidence, to try again. These were not small questions. They were the questions that people carry in the specific part of themselves where the things they have not yet fully resolved collect. The story of Taiga and the stool and the mornings in the cold touched something in those people that the story had not been designed to touch, because it had not been designed at all. It had simply happened, one careful morning at a time, in a cold yard at the edge of a pine forest, between a woman who knew how to be still and an animal who needed someone who did. The responses that came to the center after the piece was published were more than Alice had expected. She answered each one with the same specific and direct care she brought to every communication. She did not generalize from Taiga's case to broader claims about what was possible or what was always true. She said, "This is what happened here, with this animal, with these people. What happens in other places with other animals and other people will be its own thing." She sent the article to Marta. Marta read it and sent back a short message, accurate. And then, below that, "She's all right?" Alice wrote back, "She's on the platform. The light is good this afternoon." Marta wrote, "Good." And in the enclosure, in the afternoon light that came in, at the angle that she preferred, Taiga lay on the platform with her chin on her paws, and the mountains were visible at the edge of her sight, in the direction they had always been, and the pine forest below the ridge moved slightly in the late afternoon wind, and everything that she was there. She had been many things. She had been a lynx in a mountain range, hunting and surviving, and making her territory in the way of her kind. She had been a creature in a trap, fighting and enduring, and refusing to stop paying attention. She had been an animal in a rehabilitation center, frightened and precise, and committed to the position she had built from evidence. She had been the subject of a paper and the focus of careful observation, and the beneficiary of a kind of care she had not previously encountered, and had not been sure, for a long time, how to receive. She was still all of those things. She was also, now, something more. Something built not from what had happened to her, but from what she had decided to do with what had happened to her. From the choice, made quietly and privately and entirely on her own terms, to add one new category to the model she ran against the world. The category was, this can be safe, not everything. Not forever, but this. This specific morning, and this specific presence, and this specific quality of being near something, without it taking anything. This could be safe, and she had decided that it was, and the decision had held, and the holding had changed something in the structure of how she met each new day. She was still herself. She would always be herself. The mountains lived in her in the way that the first things always live in a creature, built into the bone and the blood and the deep instincts that do not change. But she was also this, the animal on the platform in the afternoon light, who had found in a small and constrained and entirely human-built world the specific things she needed to continue, and who was continuing. One afternoon at a time, one slow breath at a time. In the full, clear, undiminished quality of her own presence, which had never dimmed and would not dim, which was the thing she had always been, and which no trap and no loss and no strange new world had managed to take from her. She was there. She had decided to stay. Dr. Helen Marsh had been a veterinarian for 24 years, and a wildlife veterinarian for 19 of them, and she had developed over that time a particular relationship with the space between what an animal needed and what an animal would allow. In her experience, that space was where most of the interesting and difficult and important work happened. Not in the procedures that went as expected, not in the cases where the animal was compliant and the treatment was clean, and the outcome was the one everyone had been working toward. In the gap between the ideal and the actual. In the moment when you knew exactly what needed to happen and were confronting, at close range, an animal that disagreed with your assessment of the situation. Tyga's case had been instructive in ways that went beyond the specific clinical challenges. It had been instructive about the nature of that gap. About the difference between an animal that would not allow necessary care because it was frightened, in the general and manageable sense of a creature responding to unfamiliar handling, and an animal that would not allow necessary care because it had a specific and developed position on what proximity from humans meant and what response it warranted. The first kind of case was common. The second was different, and it was different in a way that mattered to how you approached it, and she had not had the right language for the difference before she encountered Marta's framework. She had, like the others at the center, attended the staff meeting, where Alice made the face height observation. She had heard it and noted it and understood immediately that it was significant, though she could not have said at the time exactly what it was significant for. It had the quality of information that is more than it appears, that points at something that the information itself does not fully reveal. She had filed it in the way she filed most such observations, which was to hold it in a part of her attention that continued working on it in the background, while other things occupied the foreground. When Marta arrived and explained the distinction between hypervigilance and hyperaccuracy, the filed observation clicked into place. Face height targeting was not the behavior of a dysregulated system. It was the behavior of a precise one. A system that had been trained, by specific experience, to respond to specific stimuli in specific ways, and that was executing that training with the accuracy of something that had depended on the execution for its survival. This reframing had consequences for how she thought about the veterinary examination and what it would require. Not just the physical techniques and the safety protocols, which were what she had been planning in the usual terms, but the meaning of the examination from Tyga's perspective. What the close presence of a new human with observable intention would mean to a system running on hyper-accurate threat assessment. She had discussed this with Marta at length before the examination. Marta had been clear about what they were attempting, and what the limits of the attempt were. Clear about what she could provide, which was the familiar presence of the one constant in Tyga's world during the examination. Clear about what she could not provide, which was any guarantee that the examination would go as planned, or that the plan would hold, if Tyga's assessment determined it should not. Dr. Marsh had understood this completely. She had conducted the examination with exactly the posture Marta had described as correct. One step at a time. Stop when the body says stop. Read the body rather than the protocol. The protocol was a structure for a general case. This was a specific case, and the specific case had to be read directly. She remembered, very clearly, the 40 seconds of stillness when Tyga's weight shifted forward onto her front feet. The 40 seconds during which she held her position and did not advance, and waited for the assessment to resolve. She had held many animals in her career. Physical holds, chemical holds, the various techniques of veterinary practice with animals that could not be asked to cooperate in the human sense. She had not often been held in place herself, by something that was not a physical restraint, but was nevertheless complete, by the quality of attention of an animal that was deciding, with the full capacity of its functioning mind, whether the next 40 seconds would require action. She had been held in place by that decision, and she had waited, and the decision had resolved in the direction she had hoped for, and then she had moved forward one step at a time, and done the examination as carefully as she knew how to do it, and it had gone the way it needed to go. Afterward, in the main building, she had sat with her notes for a while before writing them up, which was unusual for her. She usually wrote her notes immediately, while the details were current. This time, she sat and thought about what had happened, and what it meant to her practice, not just in this specific case, but more broadly. What she thought was this. She had always known that the relationship between a veterinarian and an animal was not neutral, that it was not simply a matter of correct technique applied to a passive recipient, that the animal's response to the situation was part of the situation, and that the situation could go better or worse depending on the quality of attention brought to it by both parties. She had known this for 19 years, and she had practiced with this understanding. But she had not, before this examination, fully understood what it meant to have the animal be an active participant in the determination of what was permissible. Not passive recipient, not managed subject, not even simple patient. Participant. Something that had its own position on the situation and was communicating that position continuously and with precision, and expected that communication to be received and respected. She wrote in her clinical notes, more carefully than she usually wrote clinical notes. The examination was conducted with full attention to behavioral signals throughout. Animal communicated tolerance thresholds clearly. Examination adjusted in response. All findings obtained within communicated tolerance limits. It was, she thought, the most accurate description she had written of a veterinary examination in 19 years, because it was the first examination she had conducted in which the animal's communication was not background noise to be managed around, but foreground information that determined the shape of the procedure. She thought about Marta's paper. She thought about the distinction between hyperaccuracy and hypervigilance, and she thought about what it meant for veterinary practice with animals presenting this kind of behavioral profile. She thought about how different her approach to the examination would have been if she had not had the framework Marta provided. She would have been working with the standard protocols for an animal with a problematic behavioral history, which would have produced a different examination in a different way, and possibly a worse outcome. The framework had changed what was possible, not because it changed the animal, because it changed the practitioner's understanding of what they were working with. She thought about this for a long time, and she thought it was important enough to say, and she said it to Marta in a message after the paper was circulating and generating the responses it was generating. She said, "The framework changed what I was able to see, and what I was able to do, in the examination and beyond it. I want you to know that," Marta wrote back. "That's the only thing a good framework is for." Owen Birch received a copy of the article in the Natural Science publication through the Regional Wildlife Authority's newsletter, which forwarded items of interest to field staff. He read it on a Tuesday afternoon in the patrol office, with his boots drying on the radiator and a cup of tea going cold on the desk beside him. He read it twice. He had thought about those amber eyes more than he would have expected. He had thought about them on the days when the patrol work was hard, and on the days when it was straightforward, and on the days in between. He had thought about them as a kind of reference point, the image of something that maintains itself completely under conditions that would, by any reasonable measure, justify losing itself. He had found the image useful, and he had not examined too closely why he found it useful, because he was not in general a person who examined his own interior processes with particular care, But he knew the image was there, and he knew it did something for him. The article confirmed what Dmitri had told him in the brief conversations he had had with the center over the months. Taiga was alive. Taiga was well. Taiga had found some way through the particular difficulty of what she was living, and had come out the other side of it into something that, while not what she had been built for, was genuine and her own. He read the description of the first morning session, and he read the description of the session on day 7, when she had come to the wire before the gate opened, and he set the newsletter down on his desk and sat with the image of it for a while. He had been in the back of the vehicle for 6 hours and 20 minutes with the transport crate, and he had talked quietly about nothing in particular for 6 hours and 20 minutes, and she had tracked every word and every pause, without sleeping and without diminishing. He had not known, during those 6 hours, what would happen when they arrived. He had hoped for recovery, and been uncertain of it, in the way that you hope for things in this work, while maintaining the honesty to know that hope is not evidence. The evidence was in the article. She had recovered. Not completely. Not in the sense of returning to what she had been, or going back to the mountains that had made her. But she was there. She was present. She was, in the small and specific and genuine sense that the article described, continuing. He thought about sending a message to the center, to whoever was running it now that Dmitri had retired. He thought about what he would say. He thought about it for a day, and then wrote a short message to Alice, who was named in the article as the current head keeper, saying only that he was the ranger who had found Taiga and transported her to the center, and that he had read the article and was glad she was well. Alice wrote back the same day, "She is well. Thank you for finding her in time." He read the message twice, and he thought about the ravens, and about the patience of the ravens, and about the fact that the ravens had been wrong this time, which was unusual enough to still feel like something worth noting. He thought about the 6 hours in the back of the vehicle. He thought about the amber eyes, and the quality they contained. The quality that he had never found a word for, and was not sure there was a word for, but that he recognized when he saw it, and that he had seen clearly, and completely on that cold morning, in the snow, under the spruce trees. The quality of a thing that would not be diminished by what was happening to it, that would not stop being itself no matter what was brought to bear against it. He went back to work. He did his patrol. He watched for signs in the forest and on the ridgelines that things were not as they should be, and he responded to the signs he found. He did this every day, and on the days when it was hard he thought about the amber eyes, and the thinking helped, which was all any image ever needed to do. He did not visit the center. He thought about it once and decided against it, because the relationship between him and Taiga was complete. He had found her, and transported her, and she had survived, and that was the full arc of what they had been to each other, and it had been enough, and adding to it would not add anything. It was enough to know she was there. It was enough to know she was on a platform in the afternoon light, watching the direction of the mountains with her full and patient attention. It was enough to know that what those amber eyes contained, that quality he could not name, was still in them. It had always been there. It would always be there. Some things do not diminish. They are what they are, completely and without reservation, and they remain what they are through everything that happens to them. Taiga was one of those things. He had known it in the snow, in the cold, on the morning he found her. He had known it in the back of the vehicle, watching her breathe for 6 hours. He had known it when he looked at her through the wire of the transport crate, for the last time, and she looked back at him with those amber eyes that were so completely and unshakably present. He had known it then. The article simply confirmed what he had already known. She was still there. She had always been going to stay. The mountain road south of the center had a particular quality in winter that was different from any other road Dmitri had driven regularly. It was not the narrowness or the gradient, both of which he had grown accustomed to over many years. It was the way the road behaved at night, in deep cold, when the surface that had softened slightly during the afternoon refroze after dark, and became a thing that required complete attention at every moment, the kind of driving that did not allow for the partial attention you gave to familiar roads, because familiar roads could be navigated partly on habit. This road, in those conditions, could not. It required all of you, and it got all of you, and the result was that the drive home on cold nights was often a kind of enforced presence, a period of 20 minutes in which the practical demands of the situation prevented the mind from doing anything but inhabit the moment it was in. He had come to appreciate this about the road, in the years of driving it. It was one of the things he had not expected to appreciate about a feature of his commute, but had come to depend on. The enforced presence of the difficult road. The way it cleared certain kinds of accumulated clutter from the surface of the mind, and left behind only what was immediately real. On the night after the day he had watched the 7th morning session through the window, he drove home on the frozen road in this enforced presence, and what occupied the cleared surface of his mind was a single question that he was not sure he could answer, but that felt important enough to sit with. The question was, what have I been doing for 23 years? Not a self-doubting question. Not a questioning of the value of the work, or the sincerity of the commitment. He knew the value of the work. He had seen it, concretely, in the animals that had come through the center and gone back to their territories and their lives, in the ones that had been permanently placed and had found their versions of stability, in the very few that could not be helped by what the center could provide, and that he had had to mourn in the specific way this work required. He knew what the work was. He had been doing it for 23 years, and he knew it clearly. What the question was really asking was, what had he understood the work to be? What model had he been running it on? What assumptions had organized his approach from the beginning, and were those assumptions still the right ones? Or had he been shown, in the past 7 mornings of watching a young woman sit on a stool, that the assumptions had always been incomplete? The road required his attention, and he gave it. The mountain was dark on either side, and the headlights showed him a short distance ahead, and the rest was darkness, and the particular silence of a cold mountain night. He drove, and he thought about what he had understood the work to be. He had understood it as care, in the active sense. Care as an action performed by someone with knowledge and skill, directed toward an animal that needed both applied to its situation. He had understood his role as the application of that knowledge and skill. He had understood good outcomes as the products of correct application, of doing the right things in the right sequence with the right consistency. He had built 23 years of logs and protocols and staff training and enclosure management and behavioral records on that understanding, and all of it had been real and effective, and had produced genuine good in the world. And then he had watched 7 mornings of Marta sitting on a stool doing nothing, and producing something that all of it combined had not produced. Not nothing. She was doing something. The point was not that she was doing nothing. The point was that what she was doing could not be described in the language of his framework. It was not knowledge applied. It was not skill deployed. It was not correct action producing a desired outcome. It was presence offered without condition, and the outcome had followed from the offering in a way that no protocol had designed, and no technique had produced, and no expertise had orchestrated. He drove home. He parked. He sat in the car for a few minutes in the cold and thought about what he was not sure how to think about. Then he went inside, and he ate something, and he went to bed, and the next morning, he drove back to the center on the mountain road that was still icy from the night's cold, and he stood at the window, and he watched Marta sit on the stool, and he thought about what he was watching, and he thought he understood it, a little more clearly than he had the day before. Not completely. Not in a way he could easily write in either notebook, but a little more clearly. He thought that was probably how understanding arrived, in this work, and perhaps in most things. A little more clearly every day, for as long as you kept watching. There were things about the enclosure that Taiga had never adjusted to. She had made her peace with much of it, the routines, the smells, the sounds of the facility, the presence of specific humans at specific times, doing specific things. She had built her knowledge of this place over the months and years of her residence there, and the knowledge was accurate and complete, and she operated within it, with the same precision she had always brought to her understanding of her environment. But there were things she had never adjusted to, because they did not require adjustment. They required acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement was a different thing. The smell of the pine forest beyond the far fence was one of those things. It was always there, in the morning and the evening and the still hours of the night. And it was the smell of the world she had been built for, and had come from, and could not return to. She did not experience it as loss in the way that a human might experience the smell of something irrecoverably distant. She experienced it as information, the same way she experienced all information, precisely and without distortion. The smell was there. The forest was there. She was here. These were facts, and they were not in conflict with each other, and they did not require resolution. They simply were. What she had built in this place was not the same as what the forest would have given her. She understood this, not as an abstract comparison, but as a lived reality, the reality of what the days here contained, and what the days there would have contained. The difference between the constrained movement of the enclosure and the open movement of a territory. The difference between provided food and hunted food. The difference between the company of these specific humans, at these specific times, and the pure solitude of the mountain range in winter. She understood all of this. It was part of the information she carried, and she carried it without it being heavier than the rest of the information she carried, which was the practical consequence of being an animal rather than a person, of experiencing the world as the actual world, rather than as a comparison between what is and what might have been. What she had found here was specific and genuine. The platform in the afternoon light, the sheltered section in the rain, the center of the enclosure floor for her morning rest, which had the particular quality of open, visible space that she preferred. The near wall of the enclosure in the mornings when Marta was there, which had the quality of something that had been built between them one morning at a time, and that was hers and Marta's in the specific way that things are when they have been built together. Alice's presence during the afternoon maintenance, which had become a known and categorized element of her world, neither threatening nor comforting in the complicated sense, but simply accurate and reliable, and therefore something she did not need to expend energy on. These were the things of her life here. They were real, and they were hers, and she held them with the same precision she held everything, which meant she did not romanticize them, and did not diminish them. They were what they were. She was what she was. The meeting between those two things was her life, and she was living it. On a morning in the 5th spring of her residence at the center, the light came through the wire of the enclosure, in the particular way it came in spring, at an angle that was lower than summer, and warmer than winter, and fell across the floor, in lines that were golden, in a way that the winter light never was. She lay in one of those lines of light for a while, feeling the warmth of it on her coat, and she watched the near wall of the enclosure, where Marta was not sitting, because it was not a Marta morning, but where the quality of the morning suggested one might be coming. The specific quality of the light, and the temperature, and the smell of the air in early spring, had a pattern that she had learned to recognize over 4 springs at this place, and the pattern included, somewhere in its associations, the quality of Marta's presence. Not because Marta brought the spring, because both had become part of the same catalog, part of the same accumulated knowledge of what this particular world contained. She was not waiting. She was not exactly anticipating. She was simply present to the morning in the way she was present to all mornings, with all of her attention and none of her reserves held back. The gate to the yard made its sound. She was at the near wall before it opened. Marta set down her stool, and sat, and opened her notebook. Then she sat for a moment without writing, looking at the page with the same quality of attention she gave to everything, and then she wrote something in the small letters she used for the things that were most important. Tyga watched her from the wire. The morning continued in its own way. The light moved. The temperature lifted slightly. The pine forest beyond the far fence moved in a light wind, and its smell came across the yard in the particular way that spring wind carries pine smells, differently from the still cold air of winter. A bird in the pines made the sound it made in spring mornings. All of it was being tracked and filed and held with full attention. All of it was the world as it was, specific and actual and present, and she was in it, and she was present to it, and she was herself within it. This had always been the thing that the trap had not taken, and that the transport had not taken, and that the months of pain and the years of this constrained life had not taken. The thing that was simply who she was, and that could not be separated from her by any circumstance, because it was not a quality she had. It was a quality she was. Present, precise, attentive, entirely herself. She had been born with it, and she would carry it to the end, and no part of what had happened between the beginning and the end had changed it, or reduced it, or asked her to give any part of it up. This was her. This had always been her. This was the thing that Owen had seen in the snow, and that Colin had watched through the wire of the catchpole, and that Dmitri had noted in his log on the first evening, without quite knowing what he was noting. This was the thing that Marta had been present to, and had worked with, and had written about, and had understood more completely than anyone else had understood it. Not because she was cleverer, or more observant, or more dedicated than the others, but because she had sat still long enough, and quietly enough, and without enough agenda, that the thing itself had had room to be what it was, without interference. The pen on the paper, the thermos cap on the ground, the even breathing in the cold. Taiga at the wire. The morning continuing. The light moving. The mountains in their direction. The forest with its smell. Everything that was here, in this small and specific and genuine place, at this moment, which was the only moment available, and which was therefore the entire world. She was in it. She was staying. Colin Webb left the center after 2 years, and went on to work at a larger facility in the south, one with more resources and a bigger team, and a broader range of species in its care. He left on good terms, because he was the kind of person who left things on good terms, and he stayed in occasional contact with Alice and with Dimitri in the period before Dimitri's retirement. He thought about his time at the Kevsur Center with the particular fondness that people have for their early professional experiences, the places where the learning was steep, and the circumstances were real, and the things you found out about yourself were sometimes surprising, and always useful. He thought about Taiga more than he thought about any of the other animals he had worked with during those 2 years. Not because she was the most dramatic case or the most technically challenging, though she was both, because of the specific thing the case had shown him about himself, which was the discovery of the pause at the corner of the building, the half-step of hesitation he had not known he was making until Alice pointed it out, the involuntary gathering before entering the yard that had been his body's honest response to the specific quality of what awaited at the end of the approach. He had worked on that pause. After Alice named it and he had thought about it for a while, he had made a deliberate practice of spending a few minutes at that corner before beginning his rounds, standing there with his tea going cold in his hands, and thinking about what the morning was actually for, and who it was actually for, and what his role in it actually was. Not a long practice, 2 or 3 minutes, but the 2 or 3 minutes changed the quality of what came after them. He had told a colleague about this at the larger facility, 2 years into his time there, when the colleague mentioned an animal they were struggling with, and described the approach to it in terms that Colin recognized. He said, "Try pausing before you go in, not to gather your courage, to remember whose situation you're entering." The colleague had looked at him for a moment, and then said, "That's an interesting way to think about it." He had said, "It's the only way I've found that works." He did not know whether the colleague tried the pause or whether it helped if they did. He did not ask. It was the kind of advice that either found its recipient ready for it or it did not, and there was no point in pursuing it past the offering. He kept the habit for the rest of his working life, which was another 30 years, and took him through several more facilities, and a great many more animals, and a range of experiences that he could not have predicted from the starting point of his early months at the Kevsur Center. At every new facility, at every new difficult case, he found the corner that was analogous to the corner at Kevsur, the point just before the full situation became visible, and he stood there for 2 or 3 minutes, and he thought about what he was walking into, and who it belonged to. It was a small practice. Small practices were, in his experience, often the most reliable ones. They did not require the kind of effort that eroded over time. They only required the willingness to stop for a moment before continuing, which was always available. He read the article in the Natural Science publication when it came out, forwarded by someone in his professional network. He read it carefully. He had known the broad outline of what had happened at Kevsur in the years after he left, but the article gave him the specific details he had not had. The sessions on the stool, day 7, the veterinary examination, the paper and the conference and the network of practitioners who had found in Marta's framework something they had been looking for, without knowing they were looking for it. He sat with it for a while after reading it. He thought about the specific mornings he had spent at the Kevsur Center, the particular quality of that yard in winter, the cold and the pine smell, and the distant sound of the mountain road. He thought about the crate in the back of the patrol vehicle, and the 6 hours and 20 minutes. He thought about Taiga's leg in the trap, and the way those amber eyes had been watching with full and complete attention throughout the entire process of extraction. He thought about what it means to survive something, not survive it and be finished with it, not survive it and be unchanged by it, survive it and carry it and continue. He thought Taiga was very good at that. He thought that was probably the thing he had most needed to see at that stage of his career, and he was glad the ravens had been patient, and glad he had pushed through the snow, and glad the trap had held, and glad the truck had held, and glad they had arrived in time. He was glad for all of it, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts. He went back to work. Marta Allen published 5 papers in the 7 years after the Taiga case, each one built on the framework she had developed in the first, expanded it, with new cases and new evidence. qualified the places where the evidence was ambiguous, and strengthened the places where it had become clear. She was careful always to mark the state of knowledge honestly, to say what was established, and what was provisional, and what was still entirely open. Because careful marking was the difference between a framework that stayed useful and one that became a story, told for its own sake, rather than a map of something real. The fifth paper was the one that received the widest circulation, partly because the field had grown more receptive to the framework by then, and partly because a prominent wildlife conservation foundation cited it in a grant program that funded research into behavioral rehabilitation methodology, which brought it to a larger audience than her previous work had reached. She was invited to speak at 4 more conferences in the year after the fifth paper. She gave the talks with the same quality she gave everything, clearly and without drama, and she answered questions afterward with the same direct honesty she brought to the papers. She was not famous in any meaningful sense of the word. She was known in a specific community of practice, respected within it, read carefully by the people who did the relevant work. That was exactly what she wanted. She was not interested in a broader audience at the cost of precision, because precision was the thing that made the work worth doing, and a framework diluted for broader consumption was not a framework in the sense that mattered. She continued visiting the center twice a year. She continued sitting beside Taiga's enclosure in the mornings when the light was right. The sessions had changed over the years, in the way that things change when they have been what they are for a long time. They had settled into a quality of easiness that was not complacency, but was the specific ease of two things that know each other well, and do not need to work to be together. The work was done. The building was done. What remained was the inhabiting of something built, which was its own activity, and its own value, and required its own specific attention. In the 6th year of Taiga's residence at the center, Marta arrived on a morning in early autumn, when the light was gold and low over the valley, and the pine forest, below the ridge, was just beginning to turn at the highest elevations. She set up the stool in the usual place. Taiga was at the wire when the gate opened. They sat together for an hour. Marta wrote nothing. The notebook was in her bag, and the bag was on the ground beside the stool, and neither of them had been opened. She was simply there, in the way she had always been, most completely there, without agenda, without expectation, without the productive and useful restlessness that drove most of her working hours, just present. When the hour was done, she stood. She picked up her bag. She looked at Taiga for a moment, which was something she did rarely, because the looking was not the thing, but she looked, and Taiga looked back, and whatever was in that exchange was its own complete thing, and did not need to be named. She walked to the gate. She pulled it closed. She walked back to the main building. Alice was in the yard when she crossed it, checking the enrichment items in the wolf enclosure. She looked up when Marta passed. "Good morning?" she asked. "Good morning," Marta said. Alice went back to what she was doing. Inside the main building, the kettle was already on. Someone had started it, one of the morning shift keepers, and left it running, with the certainty that eventually someone would come in who wanted tea. Marta poured herself a cup and sat at the common room table and held it in both hands and let the warmth come through to her palms. She thought about the first morning, the stool in the cold, the blank page, the careful not looking. She thought about day 7 and the wire before the gate. She thought about the examination and the 40 seconds and the question Taiga had asked when it was over, the question without words that she had answered without words, and that had been enough. She thought about all of it, not with sentimentality, with the specific clarity of someone who is looking at something that has reached a point of rest and recognizing what it took to get there. It had taken a great deal. From Taiga, most of all. The trap and the transport and the months of fear and the years of this constrained life, all of it endured with the full attention and the undiminished presence that was simply who she was. From Dmitri, whose 23 years of careful daily work had given Marta the foundation she needed, without his knowing he was building it for her. From Alice, who had seen the thing about face height and said it clearly at the right moment. From Colin, who had stood with the catchpole for 7 minutes in the cold, and had been seen completely by those amber eyes, and had not looked away. From Owen, who had heard a sound in the snow, and had pushed through the trees toward it, and had crouched down at eye level, and had spoken quietly to something that could not understand the words, and had understood the quality. From all of them, and from the time, and from the specific, patient work of one morning at a time. She drank her tea. She thought that she was glad she had done the work, and that she was glad the center existed, and that she was glad those ravens had been patient enough to wait. She thought that Taiga was on the platform now in the autumn light, watching the direction of the mountains with her full and precise and entirely undiminished attention, and that the attention would be there tomorrow, and the day after, and for as long as Taiga was. She thought that was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. She finished the tea. She put the cup in the sink. She picked up her bag. She had work to do. There were always animals. There was always the next case, the next morning, the next stool set in the cold outside the next enclosure, the next quality of presents to be brought to the next animal that needed it. She went to do the work.